Section 1. The Town That Time Forgot. There is a town in America that appears on no map. It has a nuclear power plant, a harbor, a gorge, a monorail, a tire fire that has been burning for decades, two hospitals, one very questionable elementary school, and a quickie mart that never closes. It has mountains visible from the center of town. It has oceanfront property. It has a desert on one side and what appears to be dense northeastern forest on the other. It borders Ohio, and also Nevada, and also Maine, and also Kentucky, depending entirely on which day you happen to be paying attention. It has been raining yellow-skinned residents since 1989. The same yellow-skinned residents doing the same things, in the same houses, on the same streets, for 36 years. The children have not grown. The parents have not aged. The billionaire employer of a significant portion of the town's workforce has not died, despite being somewhere between 100 and 140 years old, depending on which episode's flashbacks you believe. The dog has the same bulging eyes as his owners. The fish have 3 eyes. The safety inspector responsible for preventing nuclear catastrophe at the town's primary industrial facility has an IQ of 55 and once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to see what would happen to it. Nobody in this town has ever stopped to ask why. That is the most important sentence in understanding Springfield. In 36 years, across more than 780 episodes, not one character, not the teacher, not the doctor, not the local news anchor, not the man who has lived next door to a nuclear power plant for his entire life has ever turned to another character and said, "Wait a minute, something is deeply, fundamentally, structurally wrong here." They go about their days, they eat at the diner, they drink at the bar, they attend church, occasionally. They riot, fairly often, usually over something trivial. And the cooling towers stand behind them in every outdoor shot like a reminder that nobody reads, leaking invisible things into the water and the air and the biology of every person who has ever called this place home. We are going to spend the next several hours in Springfield. And we are going to look at it the way the residents never do, carefully, with both eyes open, following every thread until it leads somewhere. The show never intended to take us out loud, but has been taking us quietly, in the background, across every single season it has ever aired. Before we get into any of that, let's start with the thing that should bother you, before anything else does. Springfield is frozen. Not metaphorically frozen, not thematically frozen, literally temporally frozen in a way that defies every law of biology, physics, sociology, and storytelling that we generally take for granted when watching a television program. The Simpsons debuted on the 17th of December 1989. On that night, Bart Simpson was 10 years old. He is 10 years old right now as you watch this. Lisa was 8. She is 8. Maggie was 1 year old. She remains 1 year old. Homer and Marge were in their mid-30s, which is roughly where they have stayed across nearly 4 decades of episodes, flashbacks, retcons, and timeline adjustments that would make a physicist's head hurt. 36 years have elapsed in our world. 0 years have elapsed in theirs. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. It means the show's present moment is always synchronized with the viewer's present moment. When an episode aired in 1994, the characters were living in 1994. When one aired in 2015, they were living in 2015. When the most recent season aired, they were living in whatever year that happened to be. The year slides forward. The cultural references update. The technology in the background evolves from rotary phones to smartphones. But the characters themselves do not move. They exist in a state of permanent suspension, always the same age, always the same relationship to each other, always returning to the same house on Evergreen Terrace at the end of every episode as if time is something that happens to other people. Most television shows use floating timelines. The Simpsons is not unique in this. What makes Springfield unusual is simply how long the freeze has been in effect. Other animated shows that employ the same convention, other sitcoms that reset after every episode, haven't been running long enough for the suspension to feel genuinely strange. 36 years is enough time for the children of the show's original viewers to grow up and have children of their own. Enough time for Bart to have graduated high school, gone to college, entered the workforce, gotten married, had kids, and watched those kids grow old enough to watch The Simpsons, ironically. In our world, That entire arc has happened to a human being who was born the year the show premiered. In Springfield, Bart still can't pass the 4th grade. That is where the strangeness begins, but it is nowhere near where it ends. Because once you start looking at Springfield as a place that operates by rules different from our own, once you accept that this is not just a cartoon shortcut, but a condition with a cause, everything about the show reorganizes itself into something far more interesting than a long-running animated sitcom. The yellow skin, for instance. Every person born in Springfield has yellow skin. This is the most visible and most universally accepted feature of the show's visual vocabulary. We see it and we think, cartoon. We think, art style. We think, that is simply how The Simpsons looks, and we have always known it, and there is nothing unusual about it, and we should move on. Except, when characters visit Springfield from outside, when guest stars appear, when strangers arrive, when the narrative requires the introduction of someone who was not raised in this town, they look different. Not dramatically different in a way that would break the show's visual coherence, but subtly, unmistakably different. Their proportions are more natural, their features are more normally arranged. Their skin, in many cases, is not yellow. The show draws outsiders with a visual register that sits closer to realistic human anatomy than it does to the Springfield aesthetic. The standard explanation is that the guest characters are drawn with slightly more realistic proportions to help them stand out visually, to distinguish them from the regular cast. And this is true as a production decision. But within the world of the show, within the internal logic of Springfield as a place that exists, what this means is that there is a visible, observable, consistent difference between people who live in Springfield and people who don't. The residents look one way, everyone else looks another. The people inside the contamination zone look one way, the people outside it look another. We are going to come back to that word contamination many times over the course of the next few hours. It is the word the show has been dancing around since 1989. The 4 fingers deserve a moment as well. Every Springfield resident has 4 fingers on each hand. This is true of humans and, fascinatingly, of the family dog. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family greyhound, shares the 4-fingered silhouette of his owners in a way that real dogs obviously do not. Something about living in this household, eating the food this household provides, drinking the water this household drinks, has given the family pet the same physical characteristics as the family itself. Most people watch this and don't register it. It's a cartoon. Cartoon characters have 4 fingers. That is a visual convention dating back to the earliest days of animation. But the question is not why cartoon characters have 4 fingers. The question is why the show draws its Springfield residents, human and animal alike, with this particular trait while drawing outsiders without it. If it were purely a stylistic convention, it would apply universally across all characters in the show's universe. It does not. Something is different about the people who live here. Now add the overbites, the bulging eyes. The hair that defies physics Marge's tower has maintained its precise architectural shape for 36 years without visible support structure or apparent maintenance. Maggie's spiky tuft has never grown. Homer's pattern has remained constant despite the fact that pattern baldness does not typically freeze in place on a man in his mid-30s. Bart's spikes have never softened. Lisa's star-shaped arrangement has never shifted. Hair, in the real world, changes. It responds to age, to stress, to diet, to environment, to the simple passage of time. In Springfield, it does not. In Springfield, it arrives in the form in which it will remain, perfectly preserved, for the rest of a life that never moves forward. The overbites deserve a moment too. Every member of the Simpson family has an overbite. Homer's is pronounced his jaw extends in a particular arrangement that would be notable in a real person. The kind of dental presentation that orthodontists encounter and that has specific causes in the developmental biology of the jaw. Marge has a version of it. Bart has it. Lisa has it. Maggie's features are organized around the same structural template. The overbite is not incidental to the character design. It is consistent across a family line, which means it is being depicted as inherited, as genetic, as a trait that passes from parent to child through the normal mechanisms of biological inheritance. Except that genetic traits do not become universal across an entire population in the way that the overbite has become universal in Springfield. You can have a family where overbites are common. You cannot have a town where literally every resident displays the same facial structure unless something is producing that convergence at the level of the population, not just the family. In genetics, that kind of convergence requires either a population bottleneck, an event that reduced the genetic diversity of a group to the point where shared traits became dominant, or an environmental pressure acting on everyone, simultaneously shaping everyone's biology toward the same outcome. Springfield did not experience a population bottleneck. Springfield is a moderately sized American town, with immigration and emigration and the normal demographic flow that such towns experience. There is no founding population event that would explain the universal overbite. There is, however, an environmental pressure acting on everyone simultaneously. It lives in the cooling towers. It leaks into the water. It drifts on the air. And it has been shaping the biology of this population for long enough that the shaping has worked its way into what the population looks like. And Homer's body. Homer Simpson has been shot, electrocuted, crushed, fallen from cliffs, been struck by vehicles, survived explosions, been mauled by animals, been exposed to toxic substances, and recovered from each of these events with a speed and completeness that has no parallel in human medicine. His pain tolerance is extraordinary. His healing rate is extraordinary. His ability to absorb trauma that would kill a normal person multiple times over, in some cases, and return to the couch that same evening, suggests a biology that has been fundamentally altered from the human baseline in ways that make him, in some very real sense, not quite a normal human being. The show treats this as slapstick. We are meant to laugh at Homer falling, getting hurt, bouncing back. The resilience is the joke. But beneath the joke is a question that the show never asks directly. Why is he like this? What has happened to Homer Simpson's body that makes it capable of absorbing this kind of punishment? What is the mechanism? Because there has to be a mechanism. Things don't just survive that aren't built to survive. Springfield, as we will explore in careful detail throughout this script, is a town that has been quietly providing the mechanism for 36 years. And the mechanism lives in those cooling towers, and in the water that flows downstream from them, and in the air that drifts downwind, and in the food grown in soil that has been soaking in runoff from one of the most safety violation-riddled industrial facilities in the history of American fiction. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We will go there soon, and we will go there thoroughly, and we will not come back until we have pulled every thread the evidence allows us to pull. For now, let's stay with the freeze. The fact that Springfield is frozen in time means something. It means something that goes beyond animation convention. In a show that has run for 36 years, in a show that has depicted cultural change, technological evolution, the shifting landscape of American politics and economics and social life across 4 decades, the decision to keep the family unchanged is not a neutral decision. It is a statement. The show is saying something by preserving these people, by locking them in amber at the moment the show began and refusing to let time touch them. The statement is this: the American family, as represented by The Simpsons, cannot be allowed to change. That sounds abstract. It will become concrete as we go. Homer must always be the father who means well and falls short. Marge must always be the mother who holds everything together through patience that would break a lesser person. Bart must always be the kid who is smarter than his grades and wilder than his judgment. Lisa must always be the one who sees too much and is too young to do anything about what she sees. Maggie must always be the one in the background, watching, saying nothing, storing everything. The moment these characters age, the moment the show allows time to pass, it is no longer the story of a family. It is the story of a family's end. Bart goes to college. Lisa moves away. Maggie begins to speak. Homer retires. Marge is left in a quiet house on Evergreen Terrace with a couch that nobody sits on and a television that nobody watches, and 36 years of dishes done and sandwiches made and crises averted by sheer force of patient love. That is not a comedy. That is something else entirely. So the timeline floats. The ages stay fixed. The couch is always full, the television is always on, and the credits roll the same way they have rolled since 1989, over the same street, past the same houses, into the same yellow living room, where the same family piles onto the same piece of furniture and the same theme music plays. We kept them there. Not the writers, not the network, not the production company. Us. The audience. We tuned in week after week and rewarded the show for staying the same. And the show learned that staying the same was what we... That is the central discomfort of Springfield. The town is frozen and we are not. And every time we sit down to watch it, every time we feel the particular warmth of a show we have known since childhood, we are pressing ourselves up against a window looking into a room where time stopped and everything is exactly as we left it. And part of us, the part that the show is really about, wishes we could go in. Springfield is the dream of a world that doesn't change. A world where the kids never grow up and the house always looks the same, and the beer is always cold and nobody ever has to say goodbye to anything. Over the next several hours, we are going to learn exactly how much the town has done to maintain that dream. And the answer is going to be darker than you expect. Drop a comment right now, tell us what time it is where you are and what city you're watching from. It genuinely makes this community feel like something. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We go deep on things like this regularly, and you don't want to miss the next one. Section 2. The Poisoned Water. Let's begin with what we know for certain. The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It sits on the outskirts of town. Its cooling towers are visible from the center of Springfield in almost every outdoor establishing shot the show has ever used, which means they are visible from the school, from the bar, from the church, from the courthouse, from the park where the children play. The plant is the town's primary source of electrical power. It employs a significant percentage of Springfield's working population. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, the wealthiest man in Springfield and, by the show's own accounting, one of the wealthiest men in the entire country. It is also, by any reasonable standard of measurement, one of the most dangerous industrial facilities ever depicted in American fiction. A surprise safety inspection, not a thorough investigation, just a surprise inspection found 342 violations. 342 separate, documented failures to meet basic safety requirements at an active nuclear power facility. The estimated cost to bring the plant into compliance with existing regulations was $56 million. Burns refused to pay it. He refused, not because the money was beyond his reach. Burns is a billionaire many times over, and $56 million represents a fraction of his documented net worth. But because bringing the plant into compliance would mean acknowledging that the violations existed, and acknowledging that the violations existed would mean someone might start asking questions about what those violations had already done to the environment and the people living within it. So the violations continued. Let's be specific about what they were, because the show is specific, and the specificity matters. Radioactive waste was being dumped directly into bodies of water. Springfield has a river. The river runs through the town. People fish in that river. The fish that are pulled from that river are eaten by Springfield residents. We know, because the show tells us directly, that the plant's radioactive waste was being discharged into this water system. Not accidentally, not through a leak that went undetected directly. As a disposal method, radioactive waste was being dumped onto children's playgrounds. This is not a metaphor. This is a depicted event in the show's canonical history. The waste, glowing green in the show's visual vocabulary, was being deposited in public recreational areas where Springfield's children spent their afternoons. The children played in it, presumably because the children of Springfield play in whatever is available, and nobody who oversees their environment has historically been paying close enough attention to stop them. Plutonium was being used as a paperweight on somebody's desk. Cracked cooling towers had been patched with chewing gum. Active cooling towers, performing their function of managing the thermal output of a nuclear reactor, were structurally compromised and had been repaired with a substance whose tensile strength and heat resistance are not, to put it gently, appropriate for the application. Luminous rats that glow, ran through the facility's internal infrastructure. The show presents this as background detail, incidental grotesquerie, something to register and move past. But luminous rats mean rats that have been exposed to enough radioactive material to fluoresce visibly, which means the plant's internal environment was saturated with radiation at levels sufficient to biologically alter its resident rodent population. And then there are the skeletons. Human skeletons. In the basement of the nuclear power plant. The show depicts this and moves on. No explanation is offered. No investigation follows. No character demands to know who these people were, or how they ended up dead and skeletal inside the basement of a working industrial facility. The safety inspector who is theoretically responsible for flagging exactly this kind of discovery, Homer Simpson, the man we will spend considerable time discussing, apparently did not flag it. Or if he did, nobody followed up. The people who died in that basement are the show's most pointed omission. Every other mystery in Springfield has at least a partial explanation, a fan theory with some canonical support, a fragment of the story that got told even if the full picture was never assembled. The basement skeletons have nothing. They are simply there, bodies, inside a building that has been poisoning a town for decades, and the town does not ask who they were. Now, the three-eyed fish. Blinky made his first appearance in the second season, pulled from the river near the plant by a fisherman who, presumably, did not expect to catch something with an extra eye. Blinky immediately became a news story within the show's universe. A gubernatorial candidate, Mary Bailey, running against Burns himself, used Blinky as the centerpiece of her environmental campaign. Burns was compelled to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate that it was safe. He ate it. His aide Smithers was visibly concerned. The candidate watched. The town watched. And then the moment passed, the way moments in Springfield always pass, and nobody conducted a follow-up study, and nobody tested the river, and nobody asked the question that should have been inescapable. If the radiation has given this fish a third eye, what has it done to the people who have been drinking the same water for years? That question has an answer. The show has been providing the answer since the beginning. The answer is visible in every frame that contains a Springfield resident. But the town is constitutionally incapable of connecting Blinky to itself, so the question stays unasked, and Blinky becomes a celebrity rather than a warning, and life in Springfield continues as it always has. The most direct confirmation of what the plant has done to the human population comes from a source you might not expect, Mr. Burns himself. In the 8th season episode The Springfield Files, the one where David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson guest star, and everything has a distinct X-Files flavor, Homer sees something in the woods near Springfield that he is convinced is an extraterrestrial. The FBI gets involved. The town panics. Everyone wants to know what Homer saw in the forest, and the build-up to the reveal is handled with genuine comedic craft. The reveal is this. The creature Homer saw was Burns. Specifically, Burns immediately following one of his weekly medical treatments, a regimen so chemically aggressive, so loaded with experimental compounds and controlled radiation therapy, that it leaves his body emitting a visible green glow. The treatment is necessary to keep him alive. Without it, he will die within approximately 7 days. With it, he survives one more week and then requires another dose. Burns glows. The man who owns the nuclear power plant, the man whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's water and air and soil for decades, is himself so saturated with radiation, not from passive exposure but from deliberate, weekly therapeutic application that his body produces visible light. He wanders out of his medical facility in a dazed, euphoric state, stumbling through the woods in the dark, a small glowing figure that the people of Springfield see and immediately conclude must be a visitor from another planet. This is the detail that makes everything else crystallize. Springfield looks at a glowing man emerging from the vicinity of a nuclear facility and thinks, alien. The psychological avoidance required to make that interpretive leap, to choose extraterrestrial visitor over nuclear exposure as the primary explanation, is staggering. But it is entirely consistent with everything the show has established about how Springfield processes information that would be too uncomfortable to process accurately. The plant glows in the dark. Its owner glows in the dark. The fish downstream have extra eyes. The residents have yellow skin and 4 fingers and biology that resist trauma in ways that have no normal human parallel. And the town looks at all of this and sees just how things are around here. Now, let's talk about Homer's role in this. Because Homer's role is not incidental, it is structural. Homer Simpson is the safety inspector at the Springfield nuclear power plant. His title is Nuclear Safety Inspector. His job, stated plainly, is to identify and report safety violations at an active nuclear reactor facility. He is the single, specific, designated person whose professional responsibility it is to ensure that the plant does not poison the town it sits beside. Homer has an IQ of 55. This is not a fan estimate. This is stated explicitly within the show's canon by multiple sources, including, at one point, the show's own creator in a public interview. An IQ of 55 is, by clinical definition, a significant intellectual disability. It is not a personality quirk or an exaggeration for comedic effect. It is a described cognitive limitation, and it belongs to the man who is supposed to be standing between Springfield and radioactive catastrophe. Homer sleeps at his workstation. This is depicted frequently and without apparent consequence. He eats donuts during emergency alerts. The donut incident, the one where he threw a donut into the reactor core to see what would happen, is the kind of event that at a real nuclear facility would trigger a federal investigation, the immediate suspension of operations, and a comprehensive review of every safety protocol the facility had ever implemented. At Springfield Nuclear, it was Tuesday. The show introduces something even more remarkable in the 12th season. Homer, we learn, once had a crayon removed from his brain, a crayon that had been lodged in his skull since childhood, physically obstructing neural pathways and reducing his cognitive function. When the crayon was removed, his IQ skyrocketed. He became articulate, analytical, capable of sophisticated reasoning. He could understand complex arguments. He could see through manipulation. He could evaluate the world around him with a clarity that he had never had access to before. And he used that clarity to look at his life and Springfield and see both of them for what they really were. It made him miserable. The intelligence that should have been liberating turned out to be a source of acute suffering, because the things Homer could now see clearly were things that a person in his position has no power to change. He could see the exploitation. He could see the degradation. He could see the gap between what his life was and what it might have been. He could see all of it with a precision that the crayon had previously protected him from, so he had it put back. He chose, deliberately and consciously, to return to cognitive impairment. He sat in the doctor's office and asked for the crayon to go back in, and the doctor obliged, and Homer walked back out into Springfield with his critical thinking capacity restored to its previous level, which is to say removed, and everything went back to normal. This is the moment the show uses to tell you something it cannot say directly. Homer chose the fog. He chose it because the alternative, the clear-eyed version of himself living in clear-eyed awareness of what Springfield is, was unbearable. And if Homer, in a moment of full cognitive function, found the truth of Springfield unbearable enough to surgically remove his own ability to perceive it, then what does that tell us about what the truth of Springfield actually is? The question the show never asks is the obvious one. How did the crayon get there in the first place? Homer went through his entire childhood in Springfield. He went through adolescence in Springfield. He has seen Springfield doctors. He has had checkups from Springfield medical professionals. Not one of them, across the entirety of Homer's life as a patient in this town, found a foreign object lodged in his skull. Either the medical establishment in Springfield is so comprehensively incompetent that objects in people's brains go undetected for decades, or someone in that establishment knew the crayon was there and made a professional decision not to remove it. Either the doctors of Springfield are negligent, or they are complicit. And if the medical establishment of Springfield is compromised, if the healthcare infrastructure of this town has been shaped by the same influence that shapes everything else in Springfield, which is to say the influence of the man who owns the plant, who employs the town, who has been the de facto economic authority of this community for the entirety of its modern history, then Homer's crayon is not just a peculiar backstory detail. It is evidence. Burns rehired Homer specifically after the German investors who briefly purchased the plant tried to fire him. When those investors took over, the first thing they did was let Homer go. The second thing they did was assess the cost of bringing the facility up to code, which nearly bankrupted the enterprise. Burns bought the plant back and immediately reinstated Homer. A competent safety inspector at that facility would have it shut down within a week. Homer is not a competent safety inspector. Homer is, in practice, the mechanism by which 342 violations remain 342 violations. His incompetence is the plant's best defense against the regulatory consequences of its own existence. Burns does not keep Homer employed out of sentimentality. Burns keeps Homer employed because Homer is the most important safety feature the plant has, in the inverted sense that his continued presence ensures nothing is ever made safe. This is the theory in its simplest form. Burns knows exactly what his plant is doing to Springfield. He has always known. He is personally dependent on managing radiation exposure in his own body because his treatments are what keep him alive, and the treatments work by the same principles as the contamination that is slowly altering the biological reality of every person who drinks the town's water or breathes its air. Burns understands radiation biology from the inside. He is his own experiment, and Springfield is his laboratory. The population too cognitively impaired by decades of exposure to question their employer. The fish with the extra eye that became a celebrity rather than a warning. The skeletons in the basement that nobody investigated. The luminous rats that nobody removed. The chewing gum on the cooling tower that nobody replaced. This is not negligence. This is management. And somewhere downstream, in a river that carries what the plant does not bother to contain, Blinky swims in circles with his 3 strange eyes, seeing more of the world than any fish should have to, and nobody in Springfield looks at him and thinks, "We are next." They are not next. They are already there. They have been there for a very long time. The mutations are not coming. The mutations are already written into the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the overbites and the hair that stays exactly as it arrived, preserved like everything else in this town in a form that no longer changes because it has been fundamentally, biologically, permanently altered by the thing that lives in those cooling towers and has been living there since before any of the current residents were born. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not a backdrop, it is the cause. It has always been the cause. Every yellow face, every 4-fingered hand, every impossibly resilient body, every 3-eyed fish, every glowing rat, every moment when the town looks at something that should frighten it and shrugs and moves on, all of it traces back to the same cracked reactor, leaking the same invisible poison into the same water that flows into the same taps that fill the same glasses that the people of Springfield drink from every morning before they go to work and come home and sit down on the couch and watch television and never, ever ask why they feel the way they feel. The plant did not make Springfield strange. The plant made Springfield Springfield, and the plant is still running. Section 3. The Man Who Won't Die. Charles Montgomery Burns is old. This sounds like a simple observation, and in the context of the show, it tends to land as a joke, a recurring gag built on the contrast between Burns's ancient frame and the contemporary world he continues to navigate with ruthless efficiency. Haha, the old man doesn't know what a hamburger is. Haha, he's baffled by the concept of cable television. Haha, he served in World War II and sometimes forgets which side he was on. But Burns's age is not a joke. It is a mystery. And when you pull at the threads of that mystery, what you find underneath is not funny at all. The show has never been entirely consistent about when Burns was born. This is partly intentional, the same deliberate continuity evasion that keeps Springfield's location perpetually undefined, and partly a consequence of 36 seasons of writers working with a character whose history is defined by his relationship to history itself. But the data points the show has provided, taken together, suggest a birth date sometime in the late 19th century, not the early 20th century. Not the 1910s or the 1920s, which would make Burns old but conventionally old. The late 1800s. Burns has personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He references the Gilded Age not as history but as lived experience. He has described working relationships with historical figures who died before anyone currently watching the show was born. He attended Yale, served in World War II in a capacity the show describes as morally questionable, even by the standards of a war in which moral complexity was somewhat built in, and has been running his nuclear power plant since the industry that the plant represents was itself in its infancy. By the most conservative reading of the available evidence, Burns is well over 100 years old. By the most generous reading, he may be pushing 140. And he doesn't just exist at this age, he functions, he strategizes, he manipulates. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation with a ruthlessness and precision that would be impressive in a person of 40, let alone someone who remembers the Spanish-American War as a current event. His body is frail, his physical strength is negligible. He weighs roughly as much as a medium-sized dog, and a moderately strong breeze seems capable of knocking him sideways, but his mind is not. His mind is arguably sharper, and certainly more focused, than anyone else in Springfield. He is the most intelligent character in a show that is full of people who are operating well below their potential. Burns operates at, and possibly beyond, his. The question of how is the one the show has been gesturing toward for its entire run. The most explicit answer appears in the Springfield files, which we have already visited but which deserves a deeper look in the context of Burns's impossible longevity. His weekly medical regimen, the one that causes the visible green glow, is described by the show as an intensive treatment that keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days. 7 days. Not months, not years, 7 days. The margin between Burns being alive and Burns being dead is measured in a single week, and it has been measured that way for as long as anyone can establish. What this means is that Burns has been alive for over a century, not because his biology supports continued life, but because he has been continuously, artificially, medically sustained across that entire span. Every week, for potentially decades, if not longer, Burns has undergone a treatment that his body cannot survive without. Take the treatment away and his system fails within the week. Provide the treatment and he gets 7 more days, and then he needs it again. This is not survival. This is maintenance. Burns's body is being operated the way you operate a machine on a scheduled service cycle, with interventions that must be administered on time or the mechanism fails. He is not a living thing in the biological sense we typically apply to that phrase. He is a biological system that has been converted into something closer to an engineered apparatus, kept running by the application of specific inputs on a precise timetable. The inputs involve radiation. Of course they do. The man who owns a nuclear facility, the man whose plant leaks radioactive material into the environment of an entire town, is himself dependent on controlled radiation exposure to maintain his biological function. The same force that is slowly altering the residents of Springfield is the force that is keeping their employer alive. The contamination and the treatment are, at their core, the same phenomenon. One is managed and precise and administered in a medical setting with the best equipment money can purchase. The other is uncontrolled and pervasive and administered by proximity to a cracked reactor with a wad of gum holding part of the infrastructure together. The difference is not the substance. The difference is who has access to the infrastructure required to control it. Burns has that infrastructure. Springfield doesn't. And that asymmetry, that fundamental difference in access to the resources required to manage what the plant produces, is the quiet thesis of everything the show has ever said about the relationship between Burns and the town. He owns. Before we get to Burns's specific medical situation, we should pause on one detail that the show treats as comedy but which has a darker resonance when you sit with it. Burns does not recognize people. He does not recognize Homer, despite Homer working directly for him for decades. This is the running gag. Burns cannot connect the face to the name, refers to Homer by different wrong names across the series, seems genuinely unable to retain the basic social information that would allow him to know who his own employees are. The comedy lands because the failure is so absolute, so persistent, so impervious to correction that it stops reading as ordinary forgetfulness and starts reading as something else. The question is what that something else is. Burns is sharp in every way that strategic intelligence requires sharpness. His long-term planning is sophisticated. His understanding of power is precise. His ability to manipulate institutions and people in service of his goals is unimpaired. These faculties are intact and operational, and arguably keener than those of anyone else in Springfield. But the small-scale recognition tasks, knowing who is standing in front of him, connecting a face to a history, remembering the name of the person who has brought him his morning briefing for 30 years, are gone. Not dimmed, gone. Whatever neural mechanism handles facial recognition and social memory in normally functioning humans is simply not working in Burns. The show implies this is a consequence of his age or his contempt for the people around him, and both of these are plausible surface explanations. But consider a third possibility. Burns has been receiving weekly radiation treatments for longer than anyone can precisely calculate. These treatments keep him alive. They maintain the disease equilibrium that allows his body to continue functioning. They are, to use the metaphor we've already established, the control rods that keep the reactor from going critical. But radiation, applied to biological tissue, even controlled, managed, therapeutically calibrated radiation does things to that tissue over time. It does things to the specific neural structures responsible for different cognitive functions. And if you apply radiation treatment to a brain for long enough, even with the best possible medical management, you will eventually produce effects. What if the facial recognition failure is one of them? What if the specific neural substrate responsible for this specific cognitive function has been, over a century of weekly treatment, worn down to the point where it no longer operates reliably? What if Burns cannot remember Homer's name because the mechanism that would allow him to remember it has been a casualty of the same process that keeps him alive? This would mean that Burns and the Springfield population are being damaged by the same substance in opposite directions. The population is damaged by uncontrolled exposure from the outside. Burns is damaged, over a much longer timeline, by controlled exposure from the inside. Both produce cognitive effects. Both involve the same basic mechanism. The difference is only the direction of delivery and the resources available to manage everything else. Burns and Springfield are the same problem with different budgets. Now let's talk about the Three Stooges. In one of the series' most quoted medical scenes, Burns visits a doctor who delivers a diagnosis that is simultaneously comic and genuinely disturbing. Burns, the doctor explains, has every disease known to medical science, every single one, simultaneously, present in his body at the same time, all of them active, all of them technically progressing. This should kill him in any number of ways. It has not. The reason it has not, the doctor explains, is that Burns's diseases exist in a state of perfect equilibrium with one another. Each illness is blocking every other illness. They are all trying to advance simultaneously, and because they are all pressing from different directions at the same time, none of them can gain dominance. The doctor calls this the Three Stooges syndrome, the image being three people trying to fit through a single doorway at once, and all of them getting stuck because none of them can get through until the others clear the way. Except in this case, none of them ever clear the way. And the result is a stalemate that has apparently been ongoing for longer than most medical professionals could meaningfully calculate. Burns is the sickest man in the United States. He is also, paradoxically, functionally indestructible, because everything that should kill him is being counterbalanced by everything else that should kill him, and the net result is a biological deadlock that keeps him walking around and making everyone's lives worse. The show plays this for laughs, as it plays most things. The doctor's delivery is comedic. Burns's reaction is appropriate to the genre. And then the scene ends, and everyone moves on, and we do not sit with the implications, which are considerable. The implications are these. If Burns's disease equilibrium is not the result of natural biological process, and it cannot be, because nothing about the situation is natural, then something is maintaining it. Something is keeping every one of those diseases in perfect balance with every other one, preventing any of them from advancing, holding the entire pathological ecosystem in suspension. And the most logical candidate for that something is the weekly treatment. The treatment is not curing Burns's diseases. It is not eliminating them or managing individual conditions in the way conventional medicine would approach the problem. It is keeping the entire system in stasis. The controlled radiation is functioning as a kind of biological regulatory mechanism, maintaining the equilibrium that prevents any single condition from gaining the upper hand. It is not healing him. It is freezing him in a state of managed disease, perpetual near death, and continued function. Burns's body is a reactor. The treatment is adjusting the control rods. Too little intervention and the whole system goes critical. Too much, and the equilibrium shifts in ways that are equally dangerous. The weekly dose is the precise calibration that keeps everything running at exactly the level required to sustain operation without triggering catastrophic failure. And the person who manages this calibration, the person who ensures Burns makes every appointment, who monitors his condition, who has spent his career learning every detail of a medical protocol that is unlike anything else in documented medicine, is Waylon Smithers. Smithers is Burns's assistant, his confidant, his most devoted employee. The show's treatment of this relationship is multifaceted and has generated substantial discussion over the years, but the element that is most relevant to the immortality question is purely logistical. Smithers manages Burns's schedule with a precision that goes beyond professional dedication. He knows when the treatments need to happen. He knows what happens if they don't. He has organized his entire life around ensuring that Burns never misses an appointment. This is not the behavior of a loyal employee. This is the behavior of someone who understands that his employer's continued existence depends on the maintenance of a specific routine, and that his own role in maintaining that routine is not optional or replaceable. The show has demonstrated in multiple episodes that Burns is functionally helpless without Smithers. Not emotionally helpless, though there are arguments to be made there too, but operationally, practically helpless. When Smithers has been absent from his duties, Burns has deteriorated. When Smithers has been present, the infrastructure of Burns's existence has continued to function. Smithers is not just an assistant, he is a life support system wearing a suit, and Smithers knows this. Whatever the full nature of his devotion to Burns, it is at least partially grounded in the knowledge that if he leaves, Burns dies. And if Burns dies, the plant closes, and the infrastructure that maintains the careful balance of this town, the economic infrastructure, the medical infrastructure, the system of obligations and arrangements that Burns has spent a century constructing comes apart. Smithers may or may not love Burns. But Smithers definitely knows that the alternative to serving Burns is watching everything Burns has built collapse. And Smithers is, whatever else he may be, a person who values structure. Burns's relationship to history adds another dimension to the immortality question that the show has never fully addressed and perhaps cannot without committing to a definitiveness it prefers to avoid. The Burns dynasty, the family, the fortune, the network of influence and ownership has been in continuous operation for a span that predates most of the institutions we associate with modern American life. Burns inherited his empire from a family that was already ancient when he took control of it. The wealth goes back to the Gilded Age. The family tree, in the show's occasional depictions of it, extends into centuries past. The question this raises is one the show has never answered. Was Burns the first member of his family to find a way around the normal timeline of biological life? If the Burns dynasty has maintained its wealth, its influence, and its control of its various enterprises across multiple generations and multiple centuries, then the continuity of that control requires explanation. Fortunes do not maintain themselves across generations without active management. Power does not transfer smoothly without deliberate systems designed to ensure the transfer. And the kind of continuity that the Burns family appears to have maintained, not just wealth but operational control, not just inheritance but ongoing direction, suggests something more than the normal mechanisms of dynastic succession. Before nuclear medicine, before radiation therapy, before any of the technological apparatus that currently keeps Burns alive. Did the Burns family have other methods? The show does not say. But it does establish, clearly and repeatedly, that Burns is a man who has been operating longer than any normal human should be able to operate, and who has built a system financial, medical, social, logistical specifically designed to ensure that this operation continues regardless of what happens to his body. Every investment, every influence, every favor, every threat, every institution that Burns has shaped to his purposes over more than a century of activity serves, at its most fundamental level, the same function: keeping Burns alive, keeping the treatments coming, keeping the reactor running, keeping the system that sustains him in continuous operation. Burns is not immortal. Immortality implies that death is simply not a possibility. Burns is something different, and in some ways more interesting. Burns has made himself too expensive to die. The infrastructure required to maintain his existence is so extensive, so deeply embedded in the economic and social life of Springfield, that the cost of losing him to the town, to the systems that depend on the plant, to the network of relationships he has constructed over decades, is greater than the cost of keeping him going. Springfield cannot afford for Burns to die. The economic disruption would be catastrophic. The power plant would shut down. The town's primary employer would close. The delicate balance of obligation and influence that Burns has spent a century constructing would collapse overnight. So he continues, week by week, treatment by treatment, dose by dose. The sickest man in the United States, kept alive by controlled radiation and the logistical competence of a devoted assistant, running a nuclear facility that is slowly doing to its neighbors what his weekly treatments do to him, except without the precise calibration, without the medical oversight, without the infrastructure that keeps the exposure managed rather than catastrophic. Burns gets the controlled version, Springfield gets the rest. And the most frightening aspect of this arrangement is not what it is doing to the town. It is how long it has been doing it. This has been happening for the entire history of the plant. The plant predates many of the current residents. The contamination predates the residents who would have been capable of noticing it first. By the time any given generation of Springfield children was old enough to begin asking questions about the water quality, or the three-eyed fish, or the unusual physical characteristics of their neighbors, they had already been drinking the water for years, had already absorbed whatever the water contained, had already in ways we will explore more fully as we go been changed. Burns knows this. The show tells us Burns knows this across multiple episodes and multiple contexts. He has the research, he has the resources, he has personal, bodily, intimate knowledge of what radiation does to biological systems because radiation is what keeps his biological systems running. He has looked at Springfield and understood it as a man looks at a system he has designed. Because in the most meaningful sense, he has. Section 4. The Sleeping Father. On the 1st of April 1993, the 18th episode of the 4th season of The Simpsons aired. It was called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was simple and built on a holiday gag. Bart, in the spirit of April Fool's Day, escalated a series of pranks on Homer until the final one went further than he intended. He took one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and put it in an industrial paint shaker. When Homer opened the can, the explosion was violent. This is already more than a normal April Fool's prank, but the show was not finished. While Homer lay in his hospital bed recovering, he noticed a vending machine across the room. He wanted a candy bar. He got out of bed to get one. The vending machine tipped over and crushed him, and Homer Simpson flatlined. He entered a coma, not a cutaway gag, not a dream sequence flagged as such. A real, canonical, clinically described coma. Homer's brain stopped producing conscious experience, and his body was maintained by the machinery of a hospital room while his family sat beside him and waited. The episode ends with Homer waking up. Bart tearfully confesses at his bedside that the whole thing was his fault. Homer springs awake and immediately starts strangling his son. The family laughs. Homer laughs. The episode ends, and the show continues, and 32 more years of Simpsons content follow without any of the characters mentioning that Homer spent 7 weeks in a coma and came out of it having permanently lost 5% of his brain function. 5%. Gone. The show is explicit about this. Homer is told, in the episode, that the coma caused permanent brain damage, a 5% reduction in function that will not recover, that represents a measurable, lasting alteration of his cognitive capacity. And Homer's response to learning that he is permanently brain damaged is to laugh, even though he says out loud that he doesn't know why he's laughing, and the family finds this charming. And the episode ends, unless it didn't end, unless Homer didn't wake up at all. This is the Homer coma theory, and it is the most discussed, most debated, most internally consistent fan theory in the history of The Simpsons. The premise, as it was originally proposed, is simple. Homer did not wake up from his coma in April of 1993. Everything that has aired since that date, every storyline, every character development, every guest appearance, every impossible adventure, every increasingly surreal episode is a dream being generated by the unconscious mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, losing brain function by fractions while his family sits beside him and waits for him to open his eyes. He never does. The evidence for this theory is not a single smoking gun. It is an accumulation, a slow, patient layering of detail that becomes harder to dismiss as you move through it, and it gains its force from the way it explains things that otherwise resist explanation. Let's start with the tonal shift, because this is the piece of evidence that the theory is built on, and the piece that the show's creators have never satisfactorily addressed. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a grounded show. Grounded within the conventions of animation. Yes, it was always a cartoon. The characters always had 4 fingers and yellow skin and hair that defied physics, but grounded in the sense that the stories it told were recognizably human. Homer tries to quit drinking. Marge considers an affair and decides against it. Lisa develops a crush on a substitute teacher. Bart struggles with his grades and faces the possibility of being held back. Grandpa struggles with the indignity of aging in a society that does not particularly value the elderly. These are not exotic stories. They are the stories of a working-class American family navigating the pressures and contradictions of everyday life. Financial stress, marital tension, academic failure, parent-child conflict. The things that actually happen to actual families, told through the lens of animated satire, but rooted in a kind of truth that made the early seasons feel immediate and emotionally resonant in a way that was unusual for the medium. After the coma, everything shifts. Homer goes to space. Homer joins a secret society. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. Homer discovers that his mother is a fugitive radical who has been living underground for decades to escape the billionaire who currently employs him. Homer meets God. Then Homer meets God again. Homer travels to Brazil. Homer travels to Australia. Homer holds hundreds of different jobs. Homer befriends a rotating cast of celebrities who show up in Springfield for reasons that range from the implausible to the surreal. The escalation is not subtle. The show goes from a family sitcom about recognizable domestic struggles to a show in which the main character has survived experiences that would be unusual for an action movie protagonist, and the world around him bends to accommodate increasingly elaborate fantasies without apparent consequence or continuity. Even casual fans notice this. The internet has been debating when The Simpsons went bad for 20 years. Different people draw the line at different points, but there is broad consensus that at some point in the mid to late 1990s, the show stopped being what it was and became something else, something looser, something more chaotic, something less concerned with internal consistency. The coma theory's answer to when the show changed is precise. It didn't get bad. It didn't lose its writers or its focus or its commitment to quality. Homer's brain got worse. The dream became less coherent. The world inside the coma became less tethered to the logic of the world outside it. And as Homer's brain deteriorated as the 5% lost in the initial damage was followed by further losses across the years, as the coma deepened and the biological situation in that hospital bed became more serious, the dream became wilder, less stable, more given to the kind of impossible escalation that marks the difference between a sleeping mind, working with intact faculties, and one that is losing its grip on the structure of its own imagination. The show didn't go bad. Homer went deeper. Now, the God conversation. 6 months before the coma episode, in the Season 4 premiere Homer the Heretic, Homer has a direct conversation with God, face to face. This is not a hallucination or a dream flagged as such within the episode. Within the logic of the Springfield universe, this is God, and this is a conversation, and the things God says during it are intended as meaningful within the narrative. God tells Homer that he will learn the meaning of life, but not yet. God tells Homer that his time is coming. His time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline fits with a precision that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. God, or whatever passes for divine prophecy in a universe where God drops by for Sunday morning conversations with safety inspectors, told Homer that his waking life was coming to an end. And 6 months later, the vending machine fell and Homer's conscious life ended. And everything that has followed, all the space travel and the secret societies and the celebrity encounters and the increasingly impossible adventures, has been the dream of a man who is lying in a hospital bed, acting on the last message he received from his own theology. His time came, and in the coma, his time is endless. The aging problem, which we discussed in the first section, is the piece of evidence that the coma theory explains most elegantly. None of the other theories manage it with the same economy. Nobody in Springfield ages. The radiation theory proposes that mutated biology prevents normal cellular aging. The cartoon logic explanation says it's simply how animated series work. Both of these have merit as partial explanations. But the coma theory's version is simpler, more complete, and more emotionally legible. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went to sleep in April of 1993 and never woke up. Of course, his children don't age. His unconscious brain cannot imagine them growing up because he was not there to see it happen. His wife doesn't age because the last time he saw her, she looked exactly the way she looks in the dream. His friends don't change because his memory of them is frozen at the moment the vending machine fell, and his brain stopped processing new information about the real world. Homer's coma preserves his world exactly as it was on the day he lost it, because that is what a coma does to a mind. It locks you in place. It freezes the last image you had before the lights went out and runs it on a loop, elaborated and extended by the dreaming brain's capacity for narrative and fantasy, but fundamentally anchored to the moment of the injury. Every episode since April 1993 is Homer's brain running simulations of a life it no longer has access to, using the only reference material available, the world as it existed on the day he went under. And as the dreaming brain's resources erode, as the years in the hospital bed accumulate and the neural function slowly diminishes, the simulations become wilder, less disciplined, more given to the kind of content that has no analog in the world the simulation is supposed to be modeling. Homer goes to space because Homer's brain needs new content and has never been to space. Homer meets dozens of celebrities because Homer's brain absorbs ambient stimuli from the hospital room, voices from the television, names mentioned in conversations at his bedside, fragments of the cultural world that continue to exist outside the hospital, while he does not, and incorporates them into the dream. Every celebrity who appears in Springfield after 1993 is, under this reading, a voice Homer heard through the fog of unconsciousness, translated into a dream character by a brain that is doing its best to keep the story running. The show itself has engaged with this theory in a way that is ambiguous enough to function as either confirmation or denial, depending on how you read it. In the 34th season, a scene was apparently created and then presented as a deliberately leaked fake in which Homer wakes up from a long coma, revealing that every outlandish episode was a dream. The show then attributed this scene to hackers and declared it non-canonical, a fake, a misdirect. But the fact that the scene was created at all, that the writers animated it, voiced it, and made it look exactly like a real episode of the show says something. The writers know about the theory. They have engaged with it seriously enough to produce a visual response. Their denial came wrapped in an acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement is the part that stays with you. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the theory directly in 2015. He said it was not true. He said Homer was not in a coma. He moved on. He did not explain why nobody ages. He did not explain the tonal shift. He did not explain God's prophecy. He did not explain why the show's escalation towards surrealism maps so precisely onto the deterioration you would expect from a dreaming mind losing coherence over time. He said it was not true, and the interviewer moved on, and the fans did not move on, because the theory does something that no official explanation has ever done. It makes the show make sense. All of it. The aging freeze, the tonal shift, the celebrity flood, the increasingly physics-defying plots, the reset button that erases consequences between episodes, the fact that Homer survives everything and recovers from everything because nothing is actually happening to his body is in a hospital bed. Only his mind is in Springfield, and his mind cannot kill him because his mind is the one narrating the story. There is also the matter of what happens to the show's relationship with consequence under the coma theory. One of the most discussed features of later Simpsons seasons, a feature that gets cited frequently in arguments about when the show's quality declined, is the near-total absence of lasting consequences. Something enormous happens. Homer destroys a relationship or breaks a city record or achieves something no one in Springfield has ever achieved before. And by the start of the next episode, or sometimes by the end of the same one, everything is back to its default state. The achievement is gone. The relationship is repaired. The destruction is repaired. The status quo is restored with a completeness that makes the preceding events feel not quite real. Critics of the show's later period describe this as lazy writing. They are not wrong that it is often lazy writing, but under the coma theory, it is also something else. A dreaming mind does not maintain consequence across cycles. Dreams reset. Dreams return to baseline. The logic of a dream episode is the logic of a single night's story, and when the next night comes, the previous night's events do not accumulate into the new night's dream. The dreaming brain starts fresh, or nearly fresh, drawing on the same reservoir of memory and feeling and ambient stimulus that produced the previous night's content, but not building on the specific events of the previous cycle in the way that waking experience accumulates. The show's reset button is not a production shortcut in the coma theory. It is the fundamental structural feature of dreaming. Dreams do not have continuity. They have repetition, the same settings, the same people, the same emotional textures without the progressive accumulation that waking life produces. Homer's coma dream returns to Springfield every cycle because Springfield is the setting his unconscious has constructed. But it does not carry the events of the previous cycle forward in a way that builds toward anything, because dreams do not build. They repeat. The seasons of the show that are most celebrated, the early ones, the ones that do have consequence, that do build character across episodes, that do maintain the kind of narrative continuity that makes character development feel real, are the seasons before April 1993. The seasons of Homer's waking life. The seasons when the simulation had access to the real man's actual experience, his actual relationships, his actual ongoing story. After the coma, the simulation runs on memory alone, and memory, unlike experience, does not accumulate new consequence. It cycles through what it has, providing variations on the same material rather than progression toward anything new. This is why the later seasons feel the way they feel. It is not just that the writers got lazy, or that the show ran out of ideas, or that the characters became caricatures of themselves through overuse. All of these things are true and real and matter. But underneath them, in the coma theory's framework, is a simpler and sadder explanation. The source material ran out. Homer's dreaming brain has been working with the same reservoir since April 1993, and that reservoir, the experiences and relationships and emotional textures of a life that stopped accumulating new content 30 years ago, has been stretched to the point where the seams show. The dream gets wilder because the dreaming mind is running out of material and compensating with escalation. The celebrity appearances flood in because the brain is absorbing ambient cultural content from the hospital room environment and incorporating it to supplement a reservoir that is no longer self-replenishing. The later seasons are a man's unconscious mind doing its best with what it has, which is, in its own way, a kind of heroism. And here is the part that stays with you after you put down the theory and try to go back to watching the show normally. If the coma theory is true, then the emotional core of The Simpsons is not comedy. It is a love letter. Homer's deepest wish is so simple that it breaks something in you when you frame it this way. He wants his family. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous, infuriating, occasionally heartbreaking little boy. He wants Lisa to still be playing her saxophone in her room at 9 o'clock on a Thursday. He wants Maggie to still be small enough to fit in the crook of his arm. He wants Friday night on the couch, and Saturday morning in the driveway, and Sunday dinner at the kitchen table, and all the ordinary, unremarkable days that you don't think to treasure while you're living them. In the coma, he gets all of it. Forever. The dream gives him everything he wants and preserves it exactly as he left it. His children never grow up. His wife never leaves. His house never changes. The beer is always cold and the couch is always there, and nobody ever has to say goodbye to anything because in the dream, everything is still exactly as it was the moment before the vending machine fell and the world went dark. Homer's coma is not a tragedy, not from inside it. From inside it, it is the only heaven a man like Homer Simpson would ever ask for. Section 5. The Baby Who Knows. Maggie Simpson is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She cannot walk without falling. She cannot speak. She communicates through facial expressions and the rhythmic squeak of a pacifier, and the occasional pointed look that, if you are paying attention, conveys more information than most people manage with full sentences. She is 1 year old and she has accomplished more than every other member of her family combined. She shot a billionaire. She led a rebellion in a daycare facility against an authoritarian caretaker. She has saved her family from physical danger on multiple occasions. She has demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that exceed those of most adults she has encountered. She has been tested and found to possess a level of intelligence that the testing instruments struggle to measure. And through all of it, through every remarkable thing she has done, and every crisis she has navigated, and every impossible situation she has resolved, she has maintained her silence. Not because she cannot speak, because she has decided not to. Let's start with the moment that defines Maggie in the public consciousness, even if it is not the most interesting thing about her, the shooting. We have already discussed the Who Shot Mr. Burns mystery in detail and will go deeper into it in the next section. What matters here is not whether Maggie pulled the trigger, but what the aftermath reveals about her. A baby was identified as the person who shot the richest man in town. The police investigated. The forensic evidence was examined. The victim regained consciousness and offered testimony, and the official conclusion of the entire investigation was, yes, this infant committed an act of violence against a grown man, and there is nothing anyone can do about it because, as Chief Wiggum stated explicitly, no jury in the world would convict a baby. Case closed. The baby did it. Moving on. Except the final shot of that episode lingers. Everyone has left the room. Maggie is alone. She looks around deliberately, carefully, with the specific head movement of someone confirming that they are not being observed. And then she takes the pacifier from her mouth and moves it in a slow arc that precisely mimics the motion of someone pulling a trigger. This is not reflexive. This is not random mouth movement from an infant. This is a conscious reenactment, performed in private, after a check to confirm that no witnesses are present. The sequence of actions scan the room, confirm solitude, reproduce the motion, requires situational awareness, memory, caution, and impulse control. Those are not traits associated with babies. Those are traits associated with someone who understands exactly what they have done and has determined that public demonstration of that understanding would not serve their interests. Maggie waited until she was alone. Then she did the thing that would confirm what she knew. And then she put the pacifier back in and kept the secret, as she has always kept every secret, as she will apparently keep every secret for as long as the show continues. The Longest Daycare is a short film theatrical, released before Ice Age, Continental Drift in 2012. Academy Award nominated that runs 7 minutes and contains perhaps the clearest unambiguous demonstration of Maggie's intelligence the show has ever offered. The premise places Maggie in a daycare facility that runs with authoritarian efficiency. Inside, she encounters a caterpillar that is about to transform into a butterfly. Another baby, a recurring antagonist named Gerald, wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature action narrative in which Maggie systematically outmaneuvers the bully, the daycare staff, and the facility's physical security systems to protect the caterpillar and ultimately release the butterfly. She does all of this without speaking. She does it through observation and planning and improvisation and a kind of adaptive problem solving that most adults would struggle to maintain under pressure. She reads the environment with precision. She identifies threats before they materialize. She develops strategies and adjusts them in real time when initial approaches fail. She executes multi-step plans that require spatial awareness, timing, and the ability to predict how other people will respond to specific stimuli. Her body, limited by the motor development appropriate to a 1-year-old, can barely keep pace with what her mind is directing. She falls, she stumbles. There are things she physically cannot do because her musculature and her coordination have not developed to the point where the execution matches the intention. But she succeeds anyway, because her cognitive capacity compensates for every physical limitation her age imposes. This is the pattern that runs through every Maggie episode. Her mind operates at a level that her body cannot support. The gap between what she understands and what she can physically express is enormous and permanent, fixed by the developmental stage she inhabits and will apparently inhabit forever. And the world around her, reading her the way people tend to read infants, as passive recipients of care, as objects of affection, without meaningful agency, as the background of the story rather than a participant in it, consistently underestimates her. She has designed this. And before we lay out the evidence for why, it is worth sitting for a moment with what Maggie's communication actually looks like when you pay close attention to it. Maggie communicates constantly, through every channel available to her that is not language, the angle of her head, the quality of her gaze which the show's animators render with a range and precision that rewards close attention, distinguishing between curiosity and assessment and concern, and the particular kind of knowing look that belongs to someone who has understood something that nobody else in the room has caught yet. The specific set of her small features as they shift between states. The way she holds her pacifier higher or lower, at different speeds, with different amounts of force in ways that function as emphasis or punctuation or commentary on whatever is happening around her. The family reads her. Homer talks to Maggie as though the conversation is reciprocal, and it is, even though the reciprocation is entirely nonverbal. Marge checks with Maggie in moments of family uncertainty, looking for the quiet signal that tells her whether the thing she is considering is the right thing. Bart, in his better moments, registers what Maggie is doing with the specific attention he gives to things that interest him, which is to say genuine, focused, creative attention. They are reading a communication system that Maggie has built out of the limited materials her developmental stage provides. She did not choose these materials. She cannot speak, she cannot write, she cannot produce the kinds of output that would be recognized as intelligent communication by anyone who did not already know her. But she has taken what she has and built something functional with it, a channel that the people who love her can access while remaining invisible to everyone else. The silence is not absence. The silence is a medium. She has learned to communicate through it with more precision than most people achieve through language. And the people who do not know how to read this medium, the outsiders, the officials, the investigators, the people who came to the house looking for answers after Burns was shot, see a baby. They see a baby doing baby things, making baby sounds, occupying baby space in the background of a scene that concerns adults. They do not see what is actually there, which is a person who has been observing them with precise attention since they walked in the door and who has already formed conclusions about them that she will communicate to the family through methods the family knows how to read. Maggie sees everything. Maggie communicates everything she sees to the people who can read her. Everyone else sees a baby. The evidence for Maggie's strategic silence is not circumstantial. It is built from a pattern that becomes visible when you look at the intelligent women in this family and what visibility costs them. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. This is one of the show's foundational premises. Lisa's intelligence is the counterweight to Bart's chaos and Homer's limitations, the evidence that the family's genetic material contains more potential than its most visible representatives suggest. Lisa is a genuine prodigy. Her IQ is substantially above those of everyone in her household and most of the adults in Springfield. She is capable of understanding complex arguments, performing at the highest levels in academic environments, and seeing through the social and political dynamics of Springfield with a clarity that most of the adults around her cannot match. And none of this has made her life easier. None of it has protected her. None of it has earned her the recognition or the security or the simple human connection she is clearly looking for every time she picks up her saxophone and plays something that is too beautiful for the room she is playing it in. Lisa speaks up and gets ignored. Lisa challenges authority and gets punished. Lisa tries to improve the world around her and meets the specific kind of resistance that is reserved for people who are right in contexts that are not ready to admit it. Her intelligence is visible. She wears it outward-facing, announces herself as the person who understands things, and the response she gets from Springfield is to be consistently reminded that understanding things is not the same as being able to do anything about them. Maggie has been watching this since the day she was born. She has observed, from her position of apparent passivity, exactly what visible intelligence costs in this environment. She has seen her sister fight every day for recognition and receive isolation. She has seen the most capable person in the family be systematically undervalued by a household and a community that does not know what to do with the kind of person Lisa is. And she has drawn a conclusion that Lisa, in her passionate commitment to engagement, has never been able to draw. The less they notice you, the more you can accomplish. Think about Maggie's actual record when examined from this perspective. Every significant thing she has been done invisibly. The shooting investigation focused on Homer. The daycare rebellion succeeded because nobody was monitoring the infants closely enough to observe them organizing. Every heroic act, every display of extraordinary capability, happens in the spaces where nobody is paying sufficient attention to register what they are seeing. She has maintained her cover for 36 years by being exactly what everyone expects a baby to be: quiet, passive, dependent, unaware. The perfect observer, because the best observer is the one nobody thinks to look at. And what she has observed over 36 years in this household and this town is considerable. She has watched her father be systematically exploited by an employer who destroyed his family before Homer was old enough to understand what was happening to him. She has watched her mother hold the structure of the household together through a quality of sustained, patient love that the household consistently fails to notice because it is so reliably present. She has watched her brother be both less and more than the world has decided he is. She has watched her sister fight a system that will not yield and take the damage that comes from fighting without allies. She has stored all of it, every episode, every crisis. Every moment when the family nearly came apart, and the thing that held it together was something too subtle to name. And she waits. What she is waiting for is the only genuinely unsolved mystery in the Simpson family's story. The show has given us glimpses, the trigger motion, the daycare organization, the intelligence test scores, the moments of decisive action in impossible situations, but has never assembled them into a declared purpose. Maggie has no stated agenda. She has demonstrated capabilities without declaring intentions. She is the only character in the show whose future is genuinely opaque, not because the show hasn't thought about it, but because showing it would require revealing what she has been carrying, and the show is not ready to reveal that. Or perhaps more accurately, the show is not ready for Maggie to reveal it. Because the moment Maggie speaks, not the single word, not the Elizabeth Taylor cameo, but actually speaks, actually steps out from behind the pacifier and tells the family and the town and the audience what she has understood for 36 years, the dynamic of everything changes. A baby who knows everything but says nothing is a secret. A person who has always known everything and finally decides to say it is something entirely different. Now connect this to the radiation theory. If Springfield's contaminated environment creates biological mutations, and if those mutations affect each resident differently depending on some combination of genetic predisposition, duration of exposure, and factors we cannot identify from the evidence the show provides, then Maggie and Homer represent the extreme ends of a spectrum. Homer's mutation reduced him. Whatever the radiation has done to his cognitive function, and the show gives us both the IQ number and the physical evidence of the crayon, which we should understand as two separate but related insults to the same neural substrate it has taken, something that should have been there and diminished it. The potential is visible when the crayon comes out. The damage is visible when it goes back in. Maggie's mutation amplified her. Same environmental cause, same family, same water, same air, same radioactive background noise from the cooling towers visible from every window of the house on Evergreen Terrace. But where Homer's exposure reduced, Maggie's enhanced. Her intelligence is not normal infant intelligence. It is something that the show's own testing infrastructure describes as beyond standard measurement. Whatever the radiation has done to her, it did not do what it did to her father. Homer and Maggie are two sides of the same radioactive coin. He is what the exposure takes away. She is what the exposure, under the right conditions, gives. And if the coma theory is true, if all of this is the dream of an unconscious man lying in a hospital bed, then Maggie's extraordinary intelligence takes on a meaning that is almost too tender to look at directly. Homer cannot see Maggie grow up. He cannot watch her develop. He cannot hear her first real words, or see her first real steps, or learn what kind of person his youngest child is becoming in the real world, where time is passing and she is changing and he is not there to witness any of it. So in the dream, he makes her extraordinary. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her age. He makes her capable of things that no baby could actually do. He gives her the ability to protect herself, to navigate danger, to see what's coming before it arrives. Because in the coma, lying in that hospital bed, the thing Homer cannot stop fearing is that his family is not okay without him there. That Marge is struggling and Bart is getting into trouble. Nobody is catching and Lisa is fighting battles alone. And Maggie is just a baby, the smallest and most vulnerable person in the household, and Homer is not there. So his dreaming mind makes Maggie invulnerable in the only way it knows how to. It makes her the most capable person in the room. It gives her a mind that can handle whatever comes. It makes her safe in the way he cannot make her safe from a hospital bed. Maggie's genius is not a mutation. It is a father's prayer made dreaming. But in Springfield, in the actual, physical, non-coma version of Springfield, if such a version exists, there is a simpler and darker reading. Maggie doesn't speak because she has concluded that speech would cost her more than silence. She doesn't reveal her intelligence because she has watched what intelligence costs in this town. She observes everything, and waits because waiting, in a place like Springfield, is the only strategy with a meaningful upside. The family trusts her judgment. The show has established this, implicitly and occasionally explicitly. When the family needs confirmation or denial on something that matters, they look to Maggie, and Maggie answers with a nod or a look, or the particular set of her small features that communicates yes or no, or you are not asking the right question. She is 1 year old. She cannot walk reliably. She cannot speak more than a single word. Once, in a cameo that was never repeated, and she is the most powerful person on Evergreen Terrace. She just hasn't decided what to do about it. Section 6. Who really pulled the trigger? The summer of 1995. The Simpsons had never attempted anything like it before. No animated show had. An animated show running a genuine whodunit mystery designed with real clues, real red herrings, real narrative integrity with a national contest inviting viewers to participate, a cash prize for the winner, a promotional tie-in with America's Most Wanted, treating the fictional crime as if it were real, and a cultural moment so significant that it dominated conversation in a way that feels almost impossible to fully reconstruct from the other side of it. The setup was meticulous. Mr. Burns had spent the closing episodes of Season 6 systematically dismantling the things that mattered most to every major character in Springfield. He had stolen the oil from beneath Springfield Elementary, gutting the school's budget in a move that affected every family with a child in the building. He had financially destroyed Moe's Tavern, ending the livelihood of one of the most recognizable supporting characters in the series. He had created a sinkhole that collapsed the Springfield retirement castle, displacing the elderly residents, including Grandpa Simpson. He had caused the injury of Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, in a manner that was personal enough to feel targeted. And then, for his grand finale, he had built a massive mechanical disc and used it to blot out the sun over Springfield, not as a metaphor, but as a literal act, removing the primary energy source for all biological life in the region in order to force every resident to purchase electricity from his power plant. When Smithers objected to this final step, Burns fired him on the spot immediately. The loyalty of years, the service of a lifetime, dismissed in a moment because Smithers had the audacity to suggest that stealing the sun from an entire community might be taking things too far. By the end of Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1, every significant character in Springfield had a specific, serious, personally motivated reason to want Burns dead. Every one of them. The show had taken its time establishing each motive with narrative care. Homer, because Burns had been unable to remember his name across years of employment despite Homer working directly for him, and the humiliation of this erasure had built to a breaking point. Bart and Lisa, because the school's funding was gone. Grandpa, because his home was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, because he had lost his job at the school when the budget collapsed. Tito Puente, because the music program Burns defunded was the thing Willie cared most about professionally. Moe, because his bar was gone. Even Smithers, freshly fired, spiraling into the kind of grief that years of suppressed devotion produce when they finally reach the surface. The entire town gathered at a public meeting to confront Burns. Multiple characters were depicted holding weapons. The confrontation built to the edge of violence, and then Burns collapsed a single gunshot wound, unexplained staggered to the town sundial, and fell with his hands pointing to two specific letters, W and S. Or, from Burns's perspective on the ground looking up at the dial, M and S. The screen went black. America waited 3 months. The contest received thousands of entries. The prize was significant. The winner would be animated into a future episode. The production team selected a sample from the pool of entries to evaluate. Not a single person in the sample had guessed correctly. Nobody won. The prize was awarded randomly, and since the randomly selected winner had not identified the right answer, they received a cash payment instead of the promised appearance. The writers acknowledged on the DVD commentary for the episodes that they were aware of one single person who had posted the correct answer to a Simpsons news group on the night of the original broadcast. This person was using a college internet account. By the time the contest ended and the production team tried to track them down, the account was inactive. They issued an open invitation on the DVD release for this person to come forward. As far as anyone has been able to establish, they never did. Think about what this means. The show's creators designed a mystery, told the public it was solvable from clues embedded in the episode, promoted a national contest around the solvability of those clues, and then when the answer was revealed, essentially no one in the country had figured it out. Either the clues were insufficient, the red herrings were too effective, or the answer did not logically follow from the evidence in the way the promotion promised it would. And the promotion explicitly promised that it would. Now let's examine the official answer, because the official answer has problems. When Part 2 aired in September, The investigation played out as a comedic procedural. Smithers confessed almost immediately, which seemed like a resolution, but his confession fell apart when it turned out he was blackout drunk during the relevant time period and had actually shot someone else entirely, old Jasper, in his wooden leg. Wrong victim, wrong location, wrong crime. One by one, the suspects were eliminated, each with alibis of varying creativity and conviction. The investigation stalled until police found a hair or an eyelash, depending on the version of events on Burns's suit. DNA analysis pointed to a Simpson. The physical evidence implicated Homer. His fingerprints were on the gun. He had perhaps the clearest motive of anyone in town. He was arrested and nearly convicted, and then Burns woke up from his coma. Burns identified his shooter, Maggie Simpson. According to Burns, after the town meeting, he encountered Maggie in the parking lot. He attempted to take her lollipop. In the struggle, his gun fell from its holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. Case closed. Except, the sundial clue, the one the show presented as the central piece of evidence and built the entire promotional campaign around, was explicitly described by Burns himself as coincidental. He stated on the record within the episode that his hands pointing at those letters was not intentional. He fell. His hands landed where they landed. The sundial clue was meaningless, according to the man whose hands were supposedly placing it. The central clue in the mystery was declared meaningless by its own source. Let's look at the gun. Burns was carrying a gun in a holster. Before the shooting, the holster was shown empty. The gun had already been removed from Burns's person before the attack took place. This means whoever shot Burns used Burns's own weapon, which means the shooter was someone who had not brought a gun to the town meeting, specifically planning violence. The town meeting was attended by people who were angry enough to carry weapons. The shooter was someone who wasn't armed, who didn't plan to shoot, who encountered an opportunity impulsively and acted on it. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this profile. So does a significant number of other characters. Burns's last words before being shot were, "Oh, it's you." He recognized his attacker. He was not afraid. He was not startled. He said, "It's you," the way you acknowledge someone familiar, not a threat, not a stranger, but someone you know well enough to recognize on sight without visible alarm. The question this raises, does Burns know Maggie Simpson? Has he ever interacted with her in a way that would make him look at a baby and say, "Oh, it's you," as if greeting someone he's met before? The show does not establish a relationship between Burns and Maggie prior to this event. Burns barely registers Homer, and Homer works directly for him. The idea that Burns would look at a baby and react with the specific kind of recognition suggested by that phrasing does not track with what we know about how Burns processes the people around him. Now, Season 18. Homer, in a moment that the show treats as a throwaway line, claims to have been the one who shot Burns. He says it, out loud, on camera. Nobody reacts. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. Homer confesses to the attempted murder of the wealthiest man in Springfield, and the response from everyone in the room is essentially nothing. Either Homer is lying for attention, which is entirely within the range of his character, or the original verdict was wrong, and Homer knows it because Homer is the one who knows what actually happened. And if Homer did it, if Homer was the one who pulled the trigger in the parking lot after the town meeting, then Maggie was framed. A baby was named as the shooter of a crime committed by her father, and the evidence that supposedly confirmed Maggie's guilt, the DNA, the sundial reading, Burns's post-coma testimony from a man who had just sustained a bullet wound and spent time in a medically unconscious state, was either manufactured, misread, or both. The Marge theory deserves serious consideration. A Reddit analysis assembled the case for Marge as the shooter, and it is, as fan theories go, genuinely compelling. Marge had every motive that the other suspects had, plus additional personal motivation stemming from what Burns had done to her family specifically. She watched Burns steal from her children's school. She watched Burns injure her dog. She watched the systematic destruction of her community by one man's unchecked greed. Burns also, in a previous episode, became infatuated with Marge. After employing her briefly, he developed feelings that were never resolved, that were simply set aside when the situation changed. Under this theory, Burns recognized Marge in the parking lot. He said, "Oh, it's you," because he knew exactly who she was. The shooting happened. Burns woke up from his coma knowing the truth. And rather than identify the woman he had once been infatuated with, rather than send Marge to prison, he looked around the hospital room, assessed his options, and pointed at the infant. A baby cannot be prosecuted, Chief Wiggum said so himself. A baby cannot defend herself against an accusation. A baby cannot deny the charge or counter Burns's testimony. And if Burns wanted to protect Marge, to use the last act of whatever complicated feeling he had toward her as a form of absolution, naming Maggie was the cleanest possible solution. The real shooter goes free. The nominal shooter cannot be convicted. And Burns, who always protects his investments in ways both transactional and personal, maintains a kind of dark integrity by absorbing the truth and substituting something manageable for it. The alternate endings confirm that even the show's writers were not fully committed to the Maggie answer. A complete alternate conclusion was produced, fully animated, fully voiced, in which Smithers was revealed as the shooter. This ending was shown as a clip in a later episode, dismissed in-universe as an ending that wouldn't have worked because it would require ignoring the DNA evidence. The character making this dismissal then compared ignoring DNA evidence to the O.J. Simpson trial, a comparison that draws an explicit line between the show's own mystery and a real-world case in which DNA was, in fact, ignored by a jury to reach a verdict. The show is winking at you. It is telling you that DNA evidence gets ignored. It is telling you that official verdicts are not necessarily true verdicts. It is telling you that in a context where powerful interests are involved, the evidence can point in whatever direction serves the people controlling the narrative. An early draft of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers seriously considered this before abandoning it, which means that at some point in the development of this mystery, the answer was not Maggie. The answer was someone else. And the clues in Part 1 were presumably adjusted to accommodate whatever answer the writers landed on, because that is how television production works. The answer comes first, and the evidence is calibrated to support it. The mystery was reverse engineered. The clues did not lead to the solution. The solution was chosen, and the clues were written backward from it. And here is the question that the reverse engineering cannot explain. In a town where every single resident had a specific personal motive to harm Burns, where dozens of people were present at a tense public confrontation carrying weapons, where the target had just committed what amounts to environmental and economic warfare against the entire community. How is it possible that only one person acted? Springfield is not known for restraint. This is a population that forms mobs over minor disagreements and burns down public buildings over misunderstandings about bears. But when Burns literally removes the sun from their environment, when he threatens the survival of every living thing in the area, from the people to the crops to the animals, one person pulls a trigger. Either the residents of Springfield are dramatically more restrained in genuine crises than their behavior in trivial ones would suggest, or the shooting was not as spontaneous as the official story requires. Maybe someone planned it. Maybe someone with knowledge of Burns's schedule, access to his movements, understanding of his habits. Someone who had spent years in close proximity to Burns and knew exactly when and where he would be vulnerable. Someone like the man who was fired that day and had served Burns so long that he knew Burns's every movement and routine. Someone like the man who had been publicly humiliated by Burns's failure to remember his name across years of direct employment. Someone like the woman who watched her children's school destroyed and her family's dog injured and her community's son stolen. The official answer is Maggie. The show committed to it. The writers stand behind it. The mystery is, by the show's own accounting, closed. But the contest nobody won. The clues Burns himself said were coincidental. The alternate endings that were fully produced. Homer's unexamined confession, and the final shot of Maggie practicing a trigger motion in an empty room while carefully confirming that no witnesses are present. All of it suggests that the greatest mystery in The Simpsons was never solved. It was closed. And in Springfield, as we are learning, those are two very different things. Section 7. The Mother They Erased. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. This was the official story, stated clearly, never questioned, accepted by the audience as background tragedy. Abe Simpson told Homer his mother had died when he was young. He showed Homer a grave. Homer mourned, in the way Homer mourns things, absorbing the loss and carrying it forward as a kind of ambient sadness that never quite surfaces cleanly, because Homer doesn't have the emotional vocabulary to surface it cleanly. He grew up without her. He grew up believing he was the kind of son whose mother had died. And he built his personality, his marriage, his entire relationship to family and belonging around that belief. And the belief was a lie. Season 7, Episode 7. Mother Simpson aired the 19th of November, 1995, widely considered one of the finest episodes in the history of the series. It begins with Homer faking his own death to avoid working on a Saturday, a very Homer reason for the plot to start, and discovers through the bureaucratic investigation of his fictional death that according to municipal records, his mother is alive. She never died. The grave Abe showed him was the grave of a poet named Walt Whitman, whose headstone Abe had apparently been passing off as his wife's burial site for the entirety of Homer's life. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave, not recognizing the grown man approaching because the last time she saw Homer he was a child. And when he proves who he is, the reunion that follows is one of the most genuinely emotional scenes the show has ever produced. Not because of anything that is said, the dialogue is typically Simpsons in its mixture of comedy and feeling, but because of what the moment represents. A man in his mid-30s, meeting his mother for the first time as an adult, at a grave that belongs to neither of them, and then Mona tells him the truth. She didn't die. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because Burns made it impossible for her to stay. The story goes back to 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife married to Abe, mother to a young Homer, living an ordinary life in Springfield during a period when the world outside Springfield was burning through civil rights and Vietnam and the counterculture and all the political upheaval that defines the late 1960s in the American imagination. And something in all of that reached Mona, changed her, radicalized her. She joined an activist group. The show depicts this with its characteristic tonal dexterity. It's funny, it's slightly absurd. It has the specific quality of Simpsons humor that manages to be genuinely touching at the same time. But the cause Mona joined was not frivolous. She targeted a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns. Let that sit for a moment. Burns did not just own a nuclear power plant. Burns owned a facility designed to produce biological weapons. A germ warfare laboratory in Springfield, in the same town where Homer was growing up, where children were playing, where families were living without any idea that the wealthiest man in town was manufacturing weaponized pathogens in a building down the road. This is presented as backstory, as origin story, as explanation for why Mona had to leave, and the show moves through it efficiently enough that it's easy to miss the weight of what is being established. Burns was manufacturing biological weapons in Springfield while simultaneously operating a nuclear plant in Springfield that has been shown to be catastrophically unsafe. This is not a man whose relationship to public health is one of negligence or indifference. This is a man whose relationship to public health is one of active, deliberate, premeditated harm. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They detonated what the show calls an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agents stored inside. During the chaos of the raid, they accidentally cured the asthma of the facility's security guard, who happened to be a young Clancy Wiggum, the man who would grow up to be Springfield's chief of police, providing a genealogy of institutional connection that the show never exploits as fully as it perhaps could. The raid was successful. The biological agents were destroyed, but Mona made one mistake. As the group fled, she stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the confusion. The person she stopped to help was Burns. She extended a hand to the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and Burns looked up at her, and he saw her face, and he remembered it. He reported her to the FBI, and Mona Simpson became a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact her family. She could not call Abe and explain what had happened, because any contact would give the FBI a trail to follow and a family to threaten. She kissed Homer goodbye while he slept. He was a child. He didn't know she was leaving. He didn't know it was goodbye and disappeared. For 27 years. Homer woke up and his mother was gone, and the story he was given was that she was dead. And he absorbed that story and carried it and let it shape him into the person he became, the person who clings to his family with a desperation that sometimes reads as comic and sometimes reads as something sadder, the person who cannot bear the thought of abandonment, whose deepest fear is being left, whose emotional security rests on the continued presence of the people he loves in the way that it tends to rest when you have lost someone without understanding why. Homer's neediness, Homer's inability to process conflict without catastrophizing, Homer's desperate desire to be liked, to be included, to matter to the people around him. All of this, the entire emotional texture of Homer's character, the things that make him sympathetic, even when he is at his worst, traces back to a morning in 1969 when he woke up and his mother was not there, and nobody told him the truth about why. When Mona returns in season 7, she and Homer have the reunion the episode has been building toward. And then Burns recognizes her. He sees her through a cab window, identifies the woman he has been hunting for 27 years, and calls the authorities. The FBI comes. Mona has to flee. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time in his life. This time he understands why she's leaving. He knows who is taking her. And then he goes back to work for that man. This is where the conspiracy takes its clearest shape. Homer has met his mother. Homer knows who drove her away. Homer knows that his employer, the man who controls Homer's professional life, who has determined Homer's financial security, whose plant produces Homer's paycheck, is the same man who destroyed his family and forced his mother to become a fugitive when Homer was 6 years old. Homer possesses this information. He goes to work for Burns on Monday. He doesn't quit. He doesn't confront. He doesn't even seem to fully process the connection, to assemble the pieces in a way that produces something actionable. He knows, on some level, because the show establishes that he knows. But the knowing doesn't become doing. It doesn't even become sustained anger. The show frames this as tragedy, and it is right to. Homer's inability to make this connection and act on it is not stupidity in the comedic sense. It is the symptom of a mind that has been damaged in ways that specifically affect the capacity for strategic long-term thinking. The crayon, the radiation, the accumulated cognitive erosion of living in Springfield's contaminated environment. All of these have taken something from Homer that would be necessary for him to translate knowledge into action of the kind that would change. His circumstances. Burns didn't just ruin Mona's life, he engineered Homer's. By driving Mona away when Homer was a child, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up emotionally broken in the specific ways that most benefit an employer who needs compliant, uncritical workers who cannot afford to leave. Homer's desperate need for approval, Homer's terror of abandonment, Homer's inability to challenge authority or sustain the kind of sustained anger that would be necessary to organize a meaningful response to his situation. All of this was produced, at least in part, by the event Burns set in motion when he called the FBI in 1969, and it is confirmed later in a revelation that extends the conspiracy backward, another generation that the arrangement was even more deliberate than the surface story suggests. Burns had done something. The show is slightly vague about the specifics, but the structure is clear. Burns had committed a crime of some kind, and Abe Simpson had discovered evidence of it. Burns and Abe struck a deal. Abe's silence in exchange for Homer's guaranteed employment at the plant, regardless of performance, regardless of errors, regardless of how many times Homer should have been dismissed on the merits. 742 documented errors. Homer was never permanently let go, because a deal protected him. A deal between his father and the man who took his mother, brokered in secret, maintained in silence, never explained to Homer because explaining it would require explaining everything: the lab, the raid, Mona's flight, the cover story about the grave, the 27 years of absence, the entire architecture of deception that Abe built and maintained to protect everyone from the truth, and that ended up protecting Burns most of all. Homer's job security wasn't a cartoon convenience, the kind of thing shows use when they need a character to keep showing up at the same location. It was a contractual obligation, a term in an agreement that Burns had every reason to maintain, because the alternative Homer, without the protections of the deal, Homer who might at some point gain enough clarity to understand what Burns had done to his family, was a Homer who could not be managed. The deal kept Homer employed. The employment kept Homer dependent. The dependence kept Homer from ever acquiring the financial or emotional stability that might have allowed him to become the kind of person who could challenge his circumstances. And the radiation and the crayon and the specific cognitive limitations they imposed kept Homer from being able to assemble the narrative of his own life clearly enough to see what had been done to it. And here's the part of this story that the show tells and does not tell simultaneously. Homer knows all of this. He knows about Mona, he knows about Burns, He knows about the lab and the raid and the FBI and the 27 years of hiding. He knows that the man who signs his paycheck is the man who took his mother. He goes to work on Monday. This is not passivity. This is not stupidity in the simple sense. This is the portrait of a man who has been rendered incapable of the specific kind of sustained, organized, consequence-bearing anger that would be required to translate knowledge into action. And the rendering has been accomplished by multiple systems, operating in concert across his entire lifetime. The crayon reduced his IQ to a level at which strategic long-term thinking is genuinely difficult. The radiation has been doing something similar to the general cognitive environment for decades. The emotional damage of maternal absence which Burns himself produced has created exactly the kind of anxiety about belonging and abandonment that makes confronting the person who controls your employment almost impossible to sustain. And Abe's deal has created a situation where Homer's job, the thing he is most afraid to lose, is guaranteed by an agreement with Burns, which means that confronting Burns is, in a very literal sense, self-defeating. If Burns is gone, the deal is gone. If the deal is gone, the guarantee is gone. If the guarantee is gone, Homer loses the one source of stability he has managed to sustain across a life that has not provided many. Burns trapped Homer before Homer was old enough to choose. And the trap is elegant in its design, if we can use that word about something this deliberately cruel. Every mechanism that would allow Homer to escape the trap is the mechanism that the trap itself has disabled. The intelligence required to see the trap clearly reduced. The emotional stability required to act on what he sees compromised by the loss Burns caused. The economic independence required to take action without catastrophic personal cost prevented by the deal. Homer cannot fight Burns because Burns already won the fight before Homer was old enough to enter it. 3 generations of Simpsons, broken by one man's grudge. Abe, who made a deal with the person who destroyed his family in order to protect what remained of it. Homer, who grew up under the consequences of that deal without ever being told what it was. And Mona, who fought back against a genuine wrong and lost everything: her home, her husband, her son, 27 years of the life she should have been living, not because she was wrong, but because the man she opposed was too powerful to be opposed without consequences. Mona Simpson died in a later season. The death scene is quiet and devastating, in the way that the best Simpsons scenes achieve quiet devastation without announcing itself, without undercutting the emotion with comedy, without offering the usual safety valve of a gag that lets everyone breathe. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches his mother die, the mother he barely knew, the mother he spent his childhood believing was already gone, the mother he got to know for a few brief episodes scattered across the show's run, and the weight of 27 stolen years sits between them without being named, because it doesn't need to be named. It is simply there, in the room, in the way he holds her hand. Burns won. Burns always wins. Because in Springfield, the person with the resources writes the rules, and the rules are maintained by institutions that Burns has spent a century shaping to his purposes. The medical establishment that didn't remove the crayon, the police force that followed whatever evidentiary trail pointed away from Burns, the legal system that deferred to Burns's version of events in the moments that mattered most. Homer works at the plant until the show ends. Because his grandfather made a deal, because his mother made a choice. Because the richest man in town needed a broken man in Sector 7G, and Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. Section 8. The Town That Votes to Forget. Season 9, Episode 2. The Principal and the Pauper, aired the 28th of September, 1997. This episode is, by the consensus of online fan communities, one of the worst episodes in the history of The Simpsons. It consistently appears near the top of worst episode lists. It has been cited by critics as the moment the show stopped caring about its own continuity. It generated immediate and fierce backlash upon airing that has not meaningfully subsided in nearly 30 years. Harry Shearer, who voices the episode's central character, publicly stated his displeasure with the storyline. The episode is the thing people point to when they want to explain what went wrong with the show. We are going to make the case that it is actually the most important episode The Simpsons has ever produced. Not the best. Not the funniest. Not the most emotionally satisfying. The most important because it is the only episode that shows you the machinery behind everything else, the mechanism that makes every reset possible. the social infrastructure that allows Springfield to forget whatever needs forgetting and move on. Here is what happens in the episode. Springfield Elementary holds an event honoring Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. During the celebration, a stranger arrives. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was held as a prisoner of war in Southeast Asia, believed killed, who survived, escaped, and came home to find that someone else had been living his life. The man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner for 2 decades is an imposter. His real name is Armand Tamzarian. Before the war, he was a street kid from the wrong part of town, directionless, in and out of trouble, with no family and no particular future. He was drafted, served in the same unit as the real Skinner, and when Skinner was captured and presumed dead, Tamzarian went to Springfield to deliver the news to Skinner's mother, Agnes. Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. The need in her was so complete, so absolute, that she did not question what she was seeing. She looked at a stranger and saw her boy, because the alternative that her boy was dead, that the loss was real, was more than she could bear to process. And Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a family or an identity that felt like it belonged to him, made the decision that seems, in the moment, understandable if not exactly defensible. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the history, the mother, the life. He moved into Springfield, absorbed the identity of a man he had watched be captured, and lived inside it for 20 years. He became a principal. He had a complicated relationship with Agnes and a more complicated one with Bart. He developed, over 2 decades, into a fully realized character with his own specific texture, his own recognizable qualities, his own relationship to the community. And then the real Seymour Skinner walked through the door. Springfield now had full, undeniable information. The man they had trusted for 20 years with their children's education, the man Agnes had treated as a son, the man who had embedded himself in the institutional life of the community, was not who he said he was. The actual Seymour Skinner, the war hero, the man whose identity had been borrowed without his consent for 2 decades, was standing in the room. The town held a meeting and voted to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issued a legal decree. The imposter would be recognized as the real Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner would be removed from Springfield. He was tied to a railroad car and physically expelled from the town, and the judge made it explicitly illegal to ever mention the truth again, under penalty of, and this is the word the show uses, torture. Let that land. A town with definitive proof that a major public figure had been operating under a stolen identity for 20 years, with the actual victim of that identity theft standing physically present in the room, voted to exile the truth and criminalize acknowledgement of it. Not because they didn't know, they knew. Not because the evidence was ambiguous, it wasn't. Because the truth was less comfortable than the lie, and comfort, in Springfield, is the primary organizing principle of collective decision-making. Fans hated this episode because they felt it violated Skinner's character. Everything we knew about him, his military service, his relationship with his mother, his psychology, his history was revealed to be constructed fiction. The character was, in the fans' view, destroyed, made meaningless, hollowed out. Everything the show had built over years of careful characterization was retroactively revealed to be a performance with no genuine foundation. The fans were not wrong that this happened. They were wrong about what it meant. The episode didn't break Skinner. The episode broke the illusion of Skinner in a way that was intentional, and used that breaking to say something true about Springfield that the show had been saying in a quieter register since the beginning. Springfield has always operated this way. It has always chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. It has always found mechanisms to forget things that would be too destabilizing to remember. The only thing unusual about the principal and the pauper is that it showed the mechanism. It put the vote on screen. It depicted the legal decree. It showed the literal expulsion of the truth-teller from the community. Every other time Springfield resets, every other time a catastrophe is forgotten between episodes, every other time a contradiction in the show's continuity resolves itself through the simple expedient of nobody mentioning it again, it happens off-screen. The reset occurs in the gap between episodes, in the space the audience doesn't see, through a process that we infer but don't observe. The principal and the pauper is the one time the show let you watch it happen in real time. It made the implicit explicit. It put the town's operating logic into action on screen in an episode with witnesses so that you could see exactly what Springfield's relationship to truth actually looks like when you strip away the humor and the warmth and the affection we have for these characters and look at the underlying behavior. The underlying behavior is this. When truth threatens the stability of the agreed-upon reality, the community destroys the truth and punishes whoever carried it. The real Seymour Skinner was the most honest man in Springfield. He walked in with proof. He brought evidence. He had his own face, his own history, his own identity to offer as verification. And Springfield's response was to tie him to a train. The episode is the key to understanding every reset in the show's history because it reveals that the resets are not accidental. They are not the result of lazy writing or production limitations or the conventional shorthand of episodic television. They are the result of a community that has made a collective decision, consciously or unconsciously, to maintain a specific version of reality and remove anything that threatens it. Consider the scope of events Springfield has experienced and subsequently forgotten. The town has been physically destroyed and rebuilt. It has been sealed under a glass dome by the federal government. It has survived nuclear near misses. It has experienced environmental catastrophes that should have permanently altered the town's relationship to its primary industrial facility. It has encountered what appeared to be extraterrestrial life. It has watched its most powerful citizen block out the sun. It has witnessed the systematic exposure of multiple public figures as frauds or criminals, or worse. And every single time, by the next episode, the slate is clean. Nobody references the dome. Nobody mentions the sun being gone. Nobody has a follow-up conversation about the three-eyed fish, or the skeletons in the basement, or the glowing billionaire, or any of the accumulated horrors that have been visited on this town across 36 seasons of production. They forgot. Or rather, they voted to forget. And the vote was unanimous. And anyone who didn't vote with the majority was managed, marginalized, dismissed, or, in the case of the real Seymour Skinner, physically expelled. Now apply this framework to everything else we have been discussing. Springfield cannot acknowledge what the nuclear plant is doing to its residents because acknowledging it would require confronting Burns. Confronting Burns would threaten the economic foundation of the town. The economic foundation is what most of Springfield's working population depends on for survival. So, the truth about the plant is voted out of existence, not through formal decree necessarily, but through the same quiet collective consensus that produced the decree in the principal and the pauper. We do not mention this. We do not ask about this. We do not connect the three-eyed fish to the yellow skin, to the four fingers, to the overbites, to Homer's superhuman resilience, to the pattern that has been visible in every frame of this show since 1989. We do not mention it because mentioning it changes everything. And in Springfield, everything changing is worse than everything continuing as it is. The three-eyed fish became a celebrity. The skeletons in the basement were never investigated. The dome was forgotten. The sun came back and nobody asked what it meant that it had been taken. And the man who did all of it is still in his office above the plant, being kept alive by weekly radiation treatments that make him glow in the dark, looking down at a town that is signed, by its silence, a collective agreement not to look up. Let's be precise about the mechanism, because the precision matters. The town did not simply forget about the real Seymour Skinner and move on in the way that communities sometimes move on from uncomfortable information by allowing it to fade from active attention. That would be passive forgetting. What Springfield did was active. It produced a legal instrument. It created an official, documented, enforceable decree stating that the comfortable fiction was the recognized truth and that the actual truth was prohibited. The mechanism of the principal and the pauper is not collective amnesia in the passive sense. It is collective amnesia institutionalized. The community did not simply stop talking about the real Skinner. The community made not talking about the real Skinner a matter of law. The community transformed the choice to forget into an obligation to forget, and backed that obligation with the threat of consequences for violation. This is important because it reveals that Springfield's amnesia is not a dysfunction or a failure of memory. It is a governance mechanism. It is how this community manages the gap between what is real and what is livable. The law does not recognize inconvenient truths because inconvenient truths would be destabilizing and stability. The specific kind of stability that allows life in Springfield to continue on its current terms is the highest value the community's institutions defend. Think about the implications for every other reset we have observed across the series. Every time Springfield recovers from a catastrophe within an episode or between episodes, without apparent memory of the catastrophe or its causes, we have been watching not the passive fading of traumatic memory, but something that looks much more like the principle and the pauper mechanism operating invisibly. There is no episode in which Springfield formally votes to forget that the dome went up, but the dome is forgotten. There is no episode in which Springfield formally votes to forget the events of who shot Mr. Burns, but the shooting fades from active community concern with remarkable speed. There is no episode in which Springfield votes to forget any of the dozens of catastrophes that should have permanently altered the town's relationship to its environment and its institutions. But they are all forgotten. The principle and the pauper is unique in having shown the mechanism explicitly. Every other reset shows only the outcome, but the mechanism is the same. The community has a standing agreement, maintained not through formal procedure in every instance, but through the shared understanding that certain things are not discussed, that certain questions are not asked, that certain connections are not made, and that the people who insist on making them will find themselves in an increasingly untenable position within the community. Springfield does not need to tie everyone who asks uncomfortable questions to a train. It only had to do it once, visibly, as a demonstration. The lesson of the real Seymour Skinner is not that this specific man was expelled. It is that this kind of man gets expelled. The man who comes back with evidence. The man who insists on the truth over the comfortable lie. That man goes. And so people in Springfield learn not to be that man. They learn it not through explicit instruction, but through the example, and through the thousand smaller social signals that accumulate in any community where certain behaviors are consistently penalized. The three-eyed fish became a celebrity because the alternative, treating it as evidence of environmental catastrophe, would require being the kind of person Springfield exiles. The human skeletons in the basement of the nuclear plant were not investigated because investigating them would require being that kind of person. The social cost of truth in Springfield is exile. Not always literal exile, not always a railroad car with a man tied to it, but a version of exile. The loss of community standing, the loss of social connection, the loss of the things that make life in a place livable. And in a town like Springfield, where the community is all there is, where the economic structure leaves most residents dependent on institutions that Burns controls, where the physical environment makes departure difficult, where the cognitive effects of the contamination mean that most residents cannot clearly evaluate the alternatives, exile is not a small cost. It is an enormous cost. It may be the largest cost available. The community defends its comfortable lives with the most powerful tool it has, the threat of taking away your sense of belonging. And against that threat, truth is a hard thing to hold. And anyone in Springfield who insists on looking up anyone who demands acknowledgement of the things the community has agreed to deny, anyone who shows up with proof and asks the town to accept it, gets the same treatment. The real Seymour Skinner got. They get tied to a train, and they get expelled from the community. And the show tells you this once, explicitly, in an episode that everyone dismissed as the worst thing it ever did. Section 9. The Prophecies. In the year 2000, The Simpsons aired an episode called Bart to the Future. The premise involved a flash forward to the future, a narrative device the show has used multiple times and typically with more emotional weight than this particular example. In this version, Lisa Simpson had become the first female president of the United States. She was dealing with the budgetary fallout of her predecessor's administration. Her predecessor's identity was mentioned in passing, as a joke, as a throwaway gag designed to land in half a second and move on. The predecessor was Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Trump's 2016 electoral victory. 16 years before a reality television personality, who had been a fixture of American celebrity culture since the 1980s, descended an escalator in a Manhattan skyscraper and announced a presidential campaign that most political professionals initially treated as performance and most cultural commentators treated as parody. When Trump won, the internet found the episode. Screenshots circulated. Clips went viral. People who had not watched The Simpsons in years were sharing frames of Lisa in the Oval Office discussing the mess left by President Trump. The phrase, "The Simpsons predicted it," became a meme of sufficient cultural penetration that it reached people who had never seen the show and had no particular interest in it. The question it prompted was the one that the Simpsons prediction phenomenon always prompts. How did they know? The list of apparent predictions extends well beyond Trump. In a 1995 episode, Homer uses a device that looks strikingly similar to a modern smartwatch. In a 1998 episode, a mathematical equation visible on a chalkboard in the background appears to anticipate the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which would not be experimentally confirmed until 2012. In a 1999 episode, Homer proposes a theory about the shape of the universe that subsequent cosmological research found at least partial support for. In a 1993 episode, a flu virus originating in Asia spreads to Springfield, causing panic buying and institutional chaos, and a community completely unprepared for a rapidly spreading pathogen. An episode that aired 27 years before the events of 2020 and felt, to many people watching it during those events, uncomfortably familiar. In 1996, Homerpalooza contained a throwaway joke about the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. 28 years between the joke and the event it appeared to describe. In a 1998 episode, the show depicted Disney acquiring 20th Century Fox, which actually happened in 2019. Across the series, the show depicted video calling technology, autocorrect errors, tablet computers, surveillance capitalism, and various other aspects of digital life, years before those aspects became ordinary features of everyday existence. The list is long enough that it has generated its own genre of content: the compilation video, the listicle, the social media post that presents the pattern as evidence of something extraordinary, time travel, prophetic writing staffs, a connection between The Simpsons and the forces that shape the future that goes beyond the normal relationship between a television show and the society it depicts. Let's talk about what is actually happening. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer on The Simpsons for most of its run, addressed the prediction phenomenon directly in multiple interviews. His explanation is blunt. If you throw enough darts, you will hit some bullseyes. That is it. That is the mechanism. The show has produced nearly 800 episodes across 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of satirical observations, speculative gags, extrapolations from current trends, and jokes about where American culture and technology and politics seem to be heading. When you generate that volume of content over that length of time, some of it will align with future events through statistical probability alone. Producer Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its peak creative seasons, was equally plain about it. Very few of the supposed predictions are actual predictions. Most are coincidences produced by the age of the episodes combined with the cyclical nature of history. Snopes and other fact-checking organizations have systematically examined many of the most widely circulated prediction claims and found that the majority have simpler explanations than foreknowledge. The Trump prediction is the most instructive example. The episode did not emerge from the writers looking at the American political landscape in 2000 and calculating a 16-year trajectory. It emerged from the observation that Trump had been publicly flirting with political ambitions since the late 1980s, had been a fixture of celebrity culture for decades, and represented a logical endpoint for a certain trajectory of American celebrity politics fusion that was already visible and already being satirized by many observers of the culture. The joke was not that Trump would be president. The joke was that the kind of America that would elect Trump was already present, already developing, already written in the patterns of a culture that the writers of The Simpsons, well-educated, perceptive observers of American life, many of them with backgrounds in the sciences and social sciences, were reading carefully and pushing to their satirical conclusions. The Disney-Fox prediction follows the same logic. Media consolidation was an accelerating trend throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. The direction of travel was visible to anyone paying attention. The writers looked at where the trend was going and wrote a joke about the logical extreme. When the logical extreme arrived, it looked like prophecy because the joke had come first and the reality had come second, and the human brain is wired to notice that sequence and find it remarkable. The smartwatch, the tablet computers, The video calling these were extrapolations from existing technological trajectories. The writers observed that devices were getting smaller and more powerful and more personal, and they imagined what the endpoint of those trends might look like. When the endpoint arrived, it looked like prediction because the imagination preceded the realization. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been one of the most educated in American television. Degrees from Harvard, Yale, and other elite institutions are common. Backgrounds in mathematics, physics, computer science, political theory, and history are represented across the writer's room. These are not people pulling guesses from thin air. They are highly intelligent, extensively educated observers of American culture who spend their careers studying patterns, identifying trends, and pushing current trajectories to their absurd but logically consistent conclusions. They are not predicting the future. They are reading the present more carefully than most people do, and the present they are reading contains the seeds of the future. The distance between reading those seeds correctly and predicting the future is large enough that it matters, but small enough that from the outside, with the benefit of hindsight, the distinction can be hard to see. Confirmation bias does the rest. The episodes that seem to predict things that actually happen get shared. They get discussed. They get included in compilation videos and listicles. They become the cultural data points associated with The Simpsons and the prediction phenomenon. The episodes, and there are far, far more of them that seem to predict things that did not happen, get forgotten. The jetpacks that never arrived. The moon colonies that didn't materialize. The political outcomes that went the other way. The technological developments that were anticipated but came out differently or didn't come out at all. Those episodes exist. They exist in enormous numbers. They are simply not selected by the mechanism that produces the prediction phenomenon because that mechanism runs on confirmation bias, which only operates in one direction. The hits are remembered, the misses are forgotten, and the hits, filtered through confirmation bias and presented without the misses for context, look like prophecy. This is the debunking. It is thorough, well-evidenced, and probably correct for the majority of cases, but it does not explain all of them. Some of the coincidences are specific in ways that trend extrapolation does not account for. The Trump episode did not just predict that a celebrity would run for president. It named Trump specifically in an episode that had no particular reason to choose Trump over any other celebrity with political ambitions, of which there were many in 2000. The Siegfried and Roy episode did not just explore the general danger of large predatory animals in performance contexts. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers, which is very close to what happened in 2003 when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers. These are not vague trend extrapolations. They are specific details that align with specific future events in ways that go beyond what the statistical model fully explains. And this is where the more interesting theory begins. The Simpsons does not predict the future. The Simpsons shapes it, not through magic, not through prophecy or foreknowledge, or any mechanism that requires abandoning empirical reasoning. Through cultural influence, operating at a scale and over a duration that most cultural artifacts never achieve. The Simpsons is one of the most watched, most quoted, most referenced, and most deeply embedded pieces of American media in history. Its jokes have entered the cultural vocabulary. Its satirical observations have become reference points that people reach for when trying to make sense of what they are seeing in the real world. When The Simpsons made a joke about Trump becoming president, that joke entered the bloodstream of American culture. Millions of people saw it, millions remembered it. It became a thing people mentioned, a thing that primed the cultural imagination, a thing that made the idea of a Trump presidency feel less like an impossible aberration and more like an inevitable punchline. The joke didn't predict the future. The joke made a specific future feel familiar before it arrived. And when it arrived, the cultural response was not shock but recognition. We've seen this before. The Simpsons already did this. The sensation of recognition is not the sensation of surprise. It is the sensation of return. The show's satire functions as cultural priming. It takes trajectories that are already in motion and presents them as accomplished facts. And when those facts eventually materialize, the audience experiences déjà vu where they might have experienced alarm, because The Simpsons showed them this coming and they absorbed the image and filed it away. And when reality caught up to the image, it felt like coming home to something they had already been to. And the mechanism of cultural normalization is worth examining more carefully because it is the most interesting thing about the prediction phenomenon and the piece that gets the least attention in the discourse around it. When a satirical depiction of an event precedes the real event by a significant margin of time, it does something specific to the cultural imagination. It files the event away under things that might happen rather than things that cannot happen. It populates the category of the possible with content that was previously in the category of the absurd. And the human brain, once it has placed something in the possible category, relates to that thing differently when it encounters evidence of its approach. The Simpsons made a Trump presidency imaginable to millions of people in the year 2000. Not plausible, the episode was clearly satirical, clearly absurdist, not a genuine prediction but a comic exaggeration of current trends, but imaginable. It placed the image in the cultural vocabulary. And when, 16 years later, the evidence of Trump's actual political ambitions became impossible to deny, many people experienced not the shock of the unimaginable, but the grim recognition of something they had, in some sense, already seen. This is different from prediction, but it is also different from coincidence. The Simpsons image of President Trump was not neutral. It was part of the cultural landscape that Americans navigated in the 16 years between the episode and the election. It was a thing people had seen, had laughed at, had thought about, and discussed. It was a reference point that existed in the cultural memory, and that was activated for many people at the moment when the reality caught up to the satire. The image primed the perception. The satire made the absurdity legible before it arrived. And when the absurdity arrived, the people who had seen the satire were not confronting it without preparation. They had already been introduced. The Simpsons was the introduction. This is the mechanism by which the show shapes culture rather than merely predicting it. Satire runs ahead of events, not because satirists have access to information that other people lack, but because satire is permitted to be more honest about what is already visible than other modes of cultural expression typically allow. A comedian or a satirist can say, the logical conclusion of this trend is X, in a way that a journalist or a politician cannot, because the comic framing provides insulation from the social costs of saying something that most people are not ready to say seriously. The joke says what the straight-faced observation cannot yet say, and the joke, once told, exists in the culture as a reference point that can be activated later, when the straight-faced observation finally becomes necessary. The Simpsons has been performing this function for 36 years. It has been the place where American culture could process, in comic form, the things that were too uncomfortable to process in other forms. The nuclear plant, the corrupt billionaire, the compromised institutions, the population that is too busy and too damaged to look clearly at its own situation. The American family that loves each other and cannot protect each other from a system that is not designed for their benefit. All of this is in the show. All of it has been in the show since the beginning, and all of it has become more recognizably real in the 36 years since the show premiered, not because the show predicted the real, but because the show was already describing the real and we are only now, slowly catching up to what it was describing. Springfield does not reflect America. America has become Springfield. 36 years of holding up a mirror, and we have stared into it so long that we have started to resemble what we see. The corrupt billionaire, the incompetent government, the nuclear power plant nobody wants to examine too closely, the population too exhausted and too precarious to spend energy on questions that might destabilize the systems they depend on for survival, the endless cycle of catastrophe and recovery and forgetting and doing it all again. The Simpsons didn't write a prediction of where America was heading. The Simpsons wrote a diagnosis of where America already was in 1989, and the diagnosis has remained accurate because the condition has not changed in the intervening 36 years. The show just wrote it down first. Section 10. The Immortal Dead. There is a man in Springfield who dies more often than any other character in the history of American animation. His name is Hans Moleman. He is small. He is elderly, apparently, though we will return to that word shortly, because the age the show actually assigns him creates a problem that the easy answer of old man gag does not fully resolve. He is nearly blind. He wears thick glasses that make his eyes look like two small, surprised planets. He walks with a shuffle that suggests his body has not caught up with whatever his brain is asking of it, or alternatively, that his body has experienced enough trauma that the shuffle is a kind of ambient damage rather than a feature of natural aging. He gets hit by cars. He gets crushed by falling objects. He gets buried alive. He gets eaten by animals. He gets struck by lightning. He gets incinerated. He falls into things, and out of things, and under things. He disappears in ways that leave no ambiguity about what has happened, and then reappears in the following episode with no explanation and no acknowledgement of the previous disappearance. By conservative estimate, Molman has died dozens of times in canonical, non-Treehouse of Horror episodes. Not dream sequences, not alternate timelines, regular episodes of The Simpsons, in which events are supposed to have some relationship to a continuous, shared reality. And yet here he is, every time, ready to be crushed again. The standard fan response to Molman is affectionate dismissal. He dies a lot, it's funny, it's a running gag, don't think too hard about it. And for most viewers, this is sufficient. The show has many running gags. Hans Moleman's death cycle is simply the most extreme version of a convention that animated shows have always employed: the character who exists to have bad things happen to them, whose suffering is the joke, whose resilience is taken for granted because the joke needs them to come back and suffer again. But Hans Moleman once stated his age as 31. Not 71, not 80, 31 years old. Look at him. Whatever the visual conventions of The Simpsons might do to human appearance, Moleman's appearance is not that of a 31-year-old by any interpretive standard. He looks like someone who has lived a very long life and accumulated considerable damage along the way. His hair is gone in the specific pattern associated with age, rather than the pattern associated with a genetic trait. His posture is the posture of a body that has been upright for many years and is beginning to feel the accumulated cost of that commitment. If he is telling the truth and there is no in-show reason to assume he is lying, then something has aged Hans Moleman catastrophically. Something took a man who should be in the early stages of adult life and turned him into what he appears to be. Something that also, through whatever mechanism it operates, made death a revolving door rather than a permanent exit. Something that made his body capable of reconstituting itself after fatal trauma to a degree that no normal biological process explains. The radiation theory has an answer for this. If the contamination from the nuclear plant has affected the Springfield population in different ways for different people, and the spread of effects we have documented suggests that it has, from Homer's cognitive damage to Maggie's cognitive amplification to the general physical anomalies shared by the entire population, then Moleman might represent the most extreme end of a particular mutation spectrum. A man whose biology has been so fundamentally altered by decades of nuclear exposure that it has done two seemingly contradictory things simultaneously. It has aged him at a catastrophically accelerated rate, turning a 31-year-old body into something that looks decades older within a time frame that normal aging could not account for. And it has made him unkillable in the normal sense of the word. These two effects seem to contradict each other, but they may share a common mechanism. If radiation exposure has altered the cellular renewal process at a fundamental level, producing rapid cell death in some tissues while creating unusual regenerative capacity in others, you might end up with someone who looks and functions as if he is elderly while also being capable of recovering from trauma that would definitively end a normal person. The aging is real, the death is real, the recovery is also real. What the radiation has produced in Moleman is not immortality in the Burns sense, engineered, maintained, resource-dependent. It is something more chaotic and less controlled. Death followed by return, with the body visibly paying the cost of each cycle in the accumulated damage of apparent aging, but never quite reaching the point at which the cost becomes non-negotiable. Under the coma theory, Moleman's function is different and somewhat disturbing. If everything since 1993 is Homer's dream, then Moleman is a background character in that dream, a figure Homer's unconscious has placed in the periphery to populate Springfield without fully committing the dreaming mind's resources to maintaining him. Consistently, when the dream's resources are stretched by more important narrative concerns, Moleman lapses, he dies. But the dream still needs him in the next scene, so the dreaming mind restores him, not out of narrative commitment to his survival, but out of the pragmatic necessity of having the background populated correctly. Moleman isn't a person in this reading. He is a prop that the dream keeps breaking and reassembling because the dream needs a certain number of background figures to feel like Springfield. Under the collective denial theory, Springfield resets. Because Springfield votes to reset Molman's death cycle is simply another thing the town has agreed not to address. A man dies in public. His neighbors watch. Nobody calls for investigation. Nobody demands explanation. Nobody even acknowledges that the person who was just crushed by a boulder is the same person who showed up for work this morning and will show up again tomorrow. Because acknowledging it would mean asking questions. And asking questions in Springfield leads to places the community has decided it does not want to go. Now let's go next door. Because the character the show has most thoroughly and quietly destroyed over 36 years is not Homer or Burns or Skinner or anyone else we have spent significant time with in this script. The character the show has most thoroughly destroyed is the one who appears, on the surface, to be the most intact, Ned Flanders. Ned is everything Homer is not. He is kind, generous, devoutly religious, physically fit, financially responsible, a good father, a good neighbor, a good citizen. He lends tools. He offers help. He extends patience to his neighbor Homer that goes so far beyond what any reasonable person would extend that it reads less like decency and more like pathology. And as we will see, that reading is exactly correct. The show has punished Ned relentlessly. His wife Maud died at a NASCAR event when a t-shirt cannon aimed at a row of women Homer had arranged in front of him to deflect the projectiles, hit her, and knocked her from the bleachers. Homer's selfishness and Maud's death are not connected by accident. They are connected by direct causation. Homer's behavior in that moment resulted in Maud Flanders' death, and Ned forgave him. Because that is what Ned does. He absorbs harm and responds with forgiveness because he has no other available response. Here is why. In an episode built around a hurricane destroying Ned's house and the community's incompetent rebuilding of it, the rebuilt house collapses almost immediately, a result of enthusiastic good intentions combined with complete absence of actual construction skill. Ned breaks. He has a complete psychological collapse. He screams at the town. He insults everyone who has wronged him over the years. He says things he has been holding inside for as long as anyone can remember, and then he is institutionalized. And in the institution, the show reveals what Ned actually is. Ned was a violent, uncontrollable child. His parents, committed to the beatnik rejection of authority and structure in all forms, never disciplined him and never allowed anyone else to discipline him. He was, by the clinical description offered in the episode, feral. His behavior was genuinely alarming, and the psychiatrist brought in to manage the situation chose an approach that the episode presents with the specific tone the show uses when it wants to say something true through the language of horror comedy. The psychiatrist spent years conditioning the aggression out of Ned. Behavioral modification, extensively applied, to the point where Ned's capacity to express anger, genuine, appropriate anger, the kind that arises in anyone who is paying attention to their circumstances, was fundamentally suppressed, not managed, not channeled, suppressed. Removed from the accessible emotional repertoire of a person whose circumstances have given him more cause for anger than almost anyone else in Springfield. The psychiatric term the episode reaches for is somewhat imprecise by clinical standards, but the thing it describes is recognizable. Ned's niceness is not a character trait in the usual sense. It is not an expression of genuine equanimity or developed spiritual practice or a deep-seated commitment to Christian values, though the show allows all of these as surface explanations for as long as it can. It is a cage, built around a personality that was determined, at an early age, to be too dangerous in its natural form, by a professional who chose suppression over integration, and whose approach was thorough enough that the cage has held for Ned's entire adult life, except for the moments when it doesn't. The moments when it doesn't are the moments that reveal what is actually underneath. When Ned snaps, it is terrifying not because of violence, though the capacity for violence is implied, but because of the depth of despair that emerges. The pain is bottomless. The accumulation of harm absorbed and forgiven without processing, the endless cycle of extending grace to people and circumstances that do not extend it back, the fundamental injustice of a life spent doing the right things in a system that does not reward doing the right things. All of it surfaces at once, in a form that is not cathartic, not liberating, not the healthy release of finally saying what needs to be said. It is a breakdown. The cage has failed. And the things that were being held in the cage are not manageable in the way that Ned, in his composed daily presentation, has made them appear. The darkest element of Ned's story, and the one that the show does not present as a joke but is not fully committed to presenting as the tragedy it actually is, involves God. In the show's own established canon, God exists. God has spoken to Homer, not in a metaphorical way, not through signs or intuitions or the interpretive work of a spiritual practice, but literally face to face. Homer has had conversations with God. God has given Homer specific information and specific guidance and has expressed, within the logic of the show's universe, a particular interest in Homer Simpson's spiritual situation. Ned has dedicated his life to God. His faith is not casual or convenient. It is the architecture of his existence, the framework through which he processes every experience, the reason he extends forgiveness when everything else about his situation would justify withholding it. God has never spoken to Ned. The drunk who sleeps through church receives divine conversation. The man who treats religion as a convenient excuse for extended leisure time, who approaches faith with a casualness that borders on disrespect, who has never in 36 years demonstrated any of the sustained commitment to practice that Ned demonstrates daily, he gets direct contact. The man who has given everything, who has organized his entire life around his faith, who has forgiven the unforgivable and kept faith with a theology that has asked enormous things of him, he gets silence. This is not a random cruelty. This is a thesis statement. The show is telling you that goodness is not rewarded in Springfield, that faith is not answered, that the system, whether we call it Burns's economic empire, or the radiation's cognitive distortion, or the community's collective agreement to maintain comfortable lies, or all three operating together, does not respond to moral behavior. It responds to power. And Ned has no power. He has compliance. He was conditioned into compliance before he was old enough to choose it, and his reward for a lifetime of compliance is everything we have cataloged above. A dead wife, a house that fell down, a neighbor who will never appreciate him, and a God who speaks to Homer. Homer Simpson does everything wrong in a system that does not punish wrongness. Ned Flanders does everything right in a system that does not reward rightness. They live next door to each other. They have always lived next door to each other. The gap between them has never closed. In Springfield, the gap is the point. Section 11. The impossible map. Springfield does not appear on any map. This is not a metaphor. This is a literal fact, established by the show itself, across 36 seasons of deliberate, sustained, meticulously maintained geographic contradiction. The town has mountains. It has oceanfront property. It has a desert accessible within a short drive. It has dense northeastern forest. It has what appears to be a harbor, a gorge, an active volcano, at least one episode, and the specific kind of flat Midwestern landscape that belongs to a region hundreds of miles from any mountains, any ocean, and any active volcanic activity. No real American town has all of these features simultaneously. The geography is impossible by the standards of physical reality. The town borders Ohio in one episode, Nevada in another, Maine in a third, and Kentucky in a fourth. Depending on which episode you are watching, Springfield is in the north, the south, the Midwest, the Northeast, or the coastal West. Lisa's area code is a Missouri prefix in episodes that explicitly reference it. The state abbreviation has been shown as NT, which is not a real state abbreviation in the American system. When Homer calls the state capital, the voice on the other end identifies the state as beginning with a vowel which narrows the field without closing it, because several American states begin with vowels. The show provides clues. The clues contradict each other. Every time a piece of information appears that would narrow the possibilities, another piece appears in a different episode that opens them back up. Matt Groening, the show's creator, gave an interview to Smithsonian Magazine in 2012 in which he confirmed that he named Springfield after Springfield, Oregon. He explained that he chose the name because it is one of the most common city names in America. There are Springfields in dozens of states, and because he grew up near Springfield, Oregon. He said the location was always intended to be Oregon. For approximately 48 hours, the mystery appeared to be solved. Springfield was in Oregon. Case closed. The internet briefly felt satisfied. Then, the show continued. Episodes aired after the 2012 interview that placed Springfield in geographic contexts inconsistent with Oregon. The writers did not honor Groening's confession. The continuity remained contradictory, and gradually it became clear that Groening's answer, while probably personally true as a statement about his creative origins, was not the answer the show was ever going to officially accept. Because the show doesn't want an answer, the show wants the question. Springfield's geographic impossibility is the show's most sophisticated structural joke, in the sense that it has been running longer than any of the actual jokes in the series and has never been resolved or acknowledged or brought to anything resembling a conclusion. It just continues. The town is everywhere and nowhere. Every viewer can find something in Springfield that feels like their own town, because Springfield has been assembled from the same way memory assembles a composite pulling from here and there, combining things that don't actually coexist in physical space, producing something that feels familiar without being identifiable. This is the surface-level reading, and it is accurate. Springfield is universal. It is designed to be everyone's town, the American community that belongs to all American communities simultaneously. Groening has confirmed this. The writers have confirmed it. It is the deliberate design philosophy of a show that wanted to be as broadly accessible as possible across the widest possible range of American experience. But there is another reading, several other readings. If the radiation theory is correct, if Springfield's contamination has done to the biology of its residents what we have been documenting across this script, then why should the contamination stop at biology? If the plant's output is powerful enough to give fish extra eyes, to alter the physical characteristics of the human population across generations, to make the town's most prominent citizen glow in the dark, why should it not also have effects on the physical environment that extend beyond the biological? The show has never proposed radiation as an explanation for Springfield's geographic impossibility. But within the logic of the radiation theory, there is at least a conceptual framework for understanding it. If the contamination zone has distorted the rules that apply to living organisms within it, the question of why the physical landscape obeys different rules from the landscape outside is at least coherent. Maybe the plant's output doesn't just poison the water and the air. Maybe it warps the spatial logic of the region in ways that produce the geographic impossibility we observe. This is speculative, and the show does not provide direct support for it. But the radiation theory is itself speculative, in the sense that the show never states it directly, and the geographic impossibility of Springfield exists alongside the biological impossibility of Springfield in a way that invites a unified explanation. The coma theory provides a simpler and more emotionally resonant one. Homer's unconscious mind does not have a precise map of America. It has impressions. It has memories assembled from experiences spread across a lifetime, family trips, movies watched on television, images absorbed from news broadcasts and magazines, and the ambient visual input of growing up in America. Mountains seen on a vacation, an ocean glimpsed from a coastal visit, desert visible from a window of something, farmland stretching out from a highway. His dreaming brain assembled Springfield from all of these, layering them on top of each other in the way dreams layer things without geographic logic, because dreams do not have geographic logic. Dreams have emotional logic. They arrange things according to how they feel in relation to each other, not according to where they actually exist on a map. Springfield feels like America because it is made from Homer's memory of America, which is scattered and fragmentary and held together by feeling rather than fact. The mountains are there because mountains feel like America. The ocean is there because the ocean feels like America. The flatness and the forest and the harbor and the gorge are all there because they all, in some emotional register, feel like home. And in a coma dream, home is the most important thing there is. But there is a third reading, and it connects to what we established in the discussion of the principal and the pauper, and it may be the most structurally significant. You cannot investigate a town you cannot find. You cannot bring federal environmental charges against a nuclear facility if the state it is located in keeps changing. You cannot hold anyone accountable for the contamination of a specific water supply if the jurisdiction in which that water supply exists is perpetually undefined. You cannot apply regulatory authority if the regulatory authority depends on knowing which state's regulations apply, and the state changes depending on the episode. Springfield's geographic uncertainty is not just a comedy device. It is a legal shield. A town with no fixed location has no fixed regulatory environment, no consistent EPA regional office, no permanent state attorney general assigned to its cases, no reliable line of federal authority that can be traced from the cracked cooling towers of the Springfield nuclear power plant to the specific governmental office responsible for addressing what those cooling towers are doing to the town around them. Burns's plant should have been shut down decades ago. The 342 violations were documented. The environmental contamination was confirmed by the federal government when they placed the dome. The biological effects on the population are visible in every frame the show has ever broadcast. And yet the plant runs. The violations persist. Burns is alive. The population is yellow. In part, this is because the population has agreed not to ask questions. In part, this is because Homer is the safety inspector. In part, this is because Burns's wealth and influence have shaped every institution in Springfield that might otherwise have addressed the problem. But in part, in the quiet, background, structural part that the show never makes explicit but has built into the architecture of Springfield's reality, it is because the town is impossible to locate. Because jurisdiction requires a fixed point, and Springfield is not a fixed point. It is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. It is the American town that belongs to no state and therefore to no regulatory framework. It cannot be regulated because it cannot be found. And the people inside it, yellow-skinned and four-fingered, and biologically altered and cognitively impaired by decades of exposure to whatever the plant produces, live in a town that is legally untouchable because the law cannot figure out where it is. The geographic impossibility of Springfield is not an accident of production. It is the last line of defense for everything that has been happening in that town since the plant first came online, and the first coolant leaked into the first stream and the first fish downstream grew a third eye that nobody was supposed to notice. Springfield floats because landing is too dangerous. Landing means a map. A map means jurisdiction. Jurisdiction means accountability. And Burns has spent over a century making sure that Springfield never has to answer for itself. Section 12. The loop that never breaks. We have been in Springfield for a long time now. We have walked through the radiation zone and looked at what it has done to the biology of an entire population. We have visited Burns in his medical suite and watched the weekly ritual that keeps him alive when everything biological about his situation suggests he should not be. We have sat by Homer's hospital bed in April of 1993 and asked whether he ever really woke up. We have watched Maggie watch everything from behind her pacifier, storing it all, saying nothing. We have reopened the Burns shooting case and found that the evidence that supposedly closed it does not hold up under the kind of scrutiny that the show never applied in the episode itself. We have followed Mona Simpson from a Springfield kitchen in 1969 to a germ warfare lab and back to a cemetery where she stood beside her son's grave before she knew it was his, and we have traced the consequences of what Burns did to her through 3 generations of a family that never quite recovered from it. We have watched a town vote to criminalize truth and expel the last honest man from its borders. We have counted the predictions and found that most of them are coincidences and some of them are not quite coincidences, and all of them together say something about the relationship between this show and the culture it has been reflecting and shaping for 36 years. We have looked at Hans Mullman die and come back and die again. We have seen what Ned Flanders' niceness actually is, what it costs, what it suppresses, and what emerges when the suppression fails. We have searched for Springfield on a map and found it everywhere and nowhere. And now we have arrived at the center of all of it, the thing that every theory touches, the thing that makes Springfield what it is and keeps it that way, the loop. The floating timeline is the most visible expression of the loop, but it is not the loop itself. The loop is something larger. The loop is the mechanism by which Springfield perpetually returns to its starting condition regardless of what happens to it along the way. The plant explodes. Springfield recovers. The plant explodes again. Springfield recovers again. Burns steals the sun. The sun comes back. The dome goes up. The dome comes down. Homer saves the town. Homer nearly destroys the town. Homer saves it again. The characters go to space, to foreign countries, to alternate dimensions, to the past and the future and the fringes of the imaginable. And every episode ends with Evergreen Terrace looking the way it always has, and the family sitting on the couch the way they always sit, and the beginning of the next week looking exactly like the beginning of every other week. The reset is the loop's most visible mechanism, but the loop is maintained by several interlocking systems, all of which we have now examined in detail. The radiation maintains the loop by keeping the population in a state of cognitive impairment sufficient to prevent sustained organized resistance to the conditions that produce the loop. You cannot break a system you cannot see clearly. And the same contamination that yellows the skin and extends the fingers and gives Homer his superhuman resilience also does something to the brain, something that keeps the critical thinking function running at a level below what would be required to look at Springfield and say, "This is not acceptable. We should change it." The collective denial maintains the loop by providing the social infrastructure for the reset. The community agreement not to remember what happened, not to follow up on what was discovered, not to connect the three-eyed fish to the yellow skin, to the cracked cooling tower. This agreement is what makes the physical reset possible. Burns can drain the dome. The sun can come back. Homer can be forgiven for whatever he did last episode. The mechanisms of forgetting are in place, reinforced by the principle and the pauper's demonstration that the community will defend those mechanisms with legal force if necessary. Burns's immortality maintains the loop by ensuring continuity of the primary power structure. As long as Burns is alive, and as long as the medical infrastructure required to keep him alive continues to function, and as long as Smithers manages that infrastructure, and as long as the wealth that funds both the treatments and Smithers's compensation remains intact, the loop has a fixed point around which everything else can organize. Burns is the axle, the loop turns around him. The coma maintains the loop by providing an internal narrator whose unconscious will cannot allow the story to end, because ending the story means waking up, and waking up means confronting whatever has happened in the real world while the dream was running. Homer's dreaming brain will not let the loop break, because breaking it means facing the one possibility Homer cannot face from inside the safety of the dream, that his family has moved on without him. That time has passed. That Bart is no longer the mischievous 10-year-old he left behind. That the real world has continued in his absence, and the person he wakes up to be will not be the person who left. The loop cannot break because too many systems depend on it not breaking. The biological system, the social system, the economic system, the narrative system, the psychological system, all of them interlock. All of them reinforce each other. All of them produce the same outcome. Springfield stays the same. The family stays the same, the plant keeps running, the water stays contaminated, the fish stay three-eyed, and we stay home on Sunday nights and turn on the television. Because the loop is not just Springfield's, it's ours. We are part of the mechanism. We have always been part of the mechanism. Every time we tune in, every time we sit down with an episode we have already seen a dozen times and let it wash over us because the familiarity is itself a pleasure, we are performing our function in the system that keeps Springfield running. We are the last reinforcement. We are the audience that makes the dream necessary. Consider what it would mean for the loop to break. If the loop breaks, Bart turns 11, Lisa turns 9. Maggie says her second word, and then her third, and then begins to assemble sentences that reveal everything she has been thinking for 36 years. Homer retires from the plant, or quits, or is finally fired in a way that sticks. Marge is left with an empty house that is too quiet in the way that houses become quiet when the children who once filled them have left for their own lives. The show becomes something else. It becomes the story of a family running out of time. It becomes the story of an American middle-class household in the late stages of its existence as a household, the children grown, the structure dissolving, the couple at the center of it left to figure out who they are when they are not defined by the ongoing project of raising children. That is not the story we want. Or rather, that is not the story we want from this particular family. We love the Simpsons for what they are now, for what they have been for 36 years, for the specific and unrepeatable configuration they represent when the credits roll. And Bart is 10, and Lisa is 8, and Homer is stumbling through the door at 5:30, and everything is exactly as it always has been. We pressed pause in 1989. We have not pressed play. And now we are here 36 years later, watching the same family, in the same house, on the same street, and the most honest thing we can say about why we are still watching is not that the show is still good, though it is often good, or that the writing is still sharp, though it is sometimes sharp. The most honest thing we can say is that we do not want to say goodbye to this particular version of this particular family, and as long as the show continues, we do not have to. The loop is not their prison. It is ours. We built it. We maintain it every time we watch. And the mechanism by which we maintain it is indistinguishable from love. But let's stay with the loop a little longer, because the loop is where all of the theories we have examined finally converge, and the convergence is the point. The radiation theory says the loop exists because the contamination has biologically locked the population into a state that prevents natural progression. Aging requires cellular renewal that functions normally. Cognitive development requires neural pathways that function normally. Change requires the capacity to perceive the need for change and act on that perception, which requires cognitive function that the radiation has compromised in the specific ways we have documented. The coma theory says the loop exists because it exists inside the frozen mind of a sleeping man, and frozen minds do not produce progressive narratives. They produce cycles. They produce the same scenarios with slight variations, return to again and again, because the dreaming brain does not have access to new experience and must work with what it had at the moment of the injury. The collective denial theory says the loop exists because the community has chosen it, not unconsciously, not through cognitive limitation alone, but through deliberate social consensus. The town voted to forget. The town made forgetting legally mandatory. The town expelled the people who wouldn't forget. The loop is the outcome of a democratic process in which the option that won was the option that required no confrontation with any difficult truth. The Burns immortality theory says the loop exists because the system's central node, the man around whom everything else organizes, has made himself permanently present. Loops require stable reference points, and Burns is the most stable thing in Springfield, more stable than the plant, more stable than the government, more stable than any institution the town contains. As long as Burns is alive, and as long as the treatments are coming, and as long as Smithers is managing the schedule, the loop has its anchor. And the prediction theory, the one that says The Simpsons doesn't predict the future but shapes it, adds the final layer. The loop is not just a Springfield phenomenon. We have exported it. We have taken the model of a community that resets after every catastrophe, that forgets what it needs to forget, that maintains the agreed-upon version of reality through social enforcement, and we have recognized it as America. We have seen Springfield in our own towns and our own institutions and our own collective decisions about what to acknowledge and what to vote out of the conversation. And the recognition is not horror most of the time. The recognition is comfort, because Springfield is home. And home is the place where the loop started and the place where the loop always returns. Now let's talk about what this means for the people trapped inside it. Homer is trapped by his cognitive limitation, his emotional damage, his economic dependence, and if the coma theory is correct, his unconsciousness. He is the least free person in Springfield in every measurable sense. And he is also the one who chose the fog, who asked for the crayon to go back in, who looked at the clear-eyed version of his life and decided that the version with the fog was more bearable. His imprisonment is in some sense chosen, and in another sense was arranged for him before he was old enough to choose anything. Marge is trapped by love. This sounds simple, and it is, but it is also the most complicated kind of imprisonment the show depicts, because it is not legible as imprisonment from the inside. Marge stays because she loves her family. She stays because the family needs her to stay. She stays because the alternative, the Marge who leaves, who decides that enough is enough, who takes stock of what her life has cost her and demands something different, is not a person Marge can imagine being. Her love is not a weakness. It is the strongest thing in Springfield. But it is also the thing that keeps her in a house, in a town, on a street, where the water is contaminated, and the husband forgets things, and the kids cycle through the same ages forever. Bart is trapped by potential. The show has repeatedly and explicitly established that Bart is more intelligent, more perceptive, and more capable than his grades and his behavior suggest. There is a version of Bart that goes somewhere. There is a version that takes the creativity and the boldness and the specific quality of his attention, his ability to read situations, to understand people, to navigate social complexity in ways that academic performance does not capture, and does something with it. That version of Bart is visible in glimpses, in the episodes that take him seriously, in the moments when the show remembers that it has a character here who could be genuinely interesting if it let him develop. He doesn't develop. The loop returns him to 10 at the start of every episode. The potential stays potential. The version of Bart that goes somewhere is the version that requires time to become himself, and Springfield does not provide time. Springfield provides the same Tuesday morning, indefinitely. Lisa is trapped by clarity. This is the cruelest imprisonment the show offers, because it is the imprisonment of being right in a place that is not organized around rightness. Lisa sees what the show allows us to see when we are paying our closest attention. She sees the corruption and the contamination, and the institutional rot, and the collective amnesia, and the systematic injustice of a community organized entirely around the comfort of the people who benefit from things staying exactly as they are. She sees all of it, with the specific precision of a mind that cannot stop noticing things. And she is 8 years old. She will always be 8 years old. She will always be the smartest person in every room she enters and the least able to do anything about what her intelligence reveals to her, because the gap between what she understands and what she has the agency to change is the gap between childhood and adulthood, and she will never be allowed to reach adulthood. The loop will return her to 8 at the start of every episode. The clarity will remain, the helplessness will remain, and the saxophone she plays in her room at 9 o'clock, the thing she retreats to when the weight of seeing everything without being able to change anything becomes too heavy, that will remain too. Maggie is waiting. Of all the people trapped in the loop, Maggie is the one who appears to have understood the nature of the trap most clearly and responded to that understanding in the most strategically sophisticated way available. She is silent because silence is armor in a place that punishes visibility. She is still because stillness is camouflage in a place that punishes standing out. She is watching because watching, in the long run, is more powerful than acting when the conditions for action are not yet right. And the question of when the conditions will be right, when Maggie will decide that the information she has stored across 36 years of silent observation is sufficient, that the moment has arrived, that the thing she has been waiting to do is finally ready to be done, is the last genuinely open question in The Simpsons. Not who shot Burns. We've been through that. Not where Springfield is. The answer is everywhere and nowhere, and the question was never meant to be answered. Not how Burns is still alive. The mechanism is clear, even if the specifics are managed by the show with deliberate imprecision. Not whether Homer is dreaming. The evidence is what it is, and the official denial is what it is, and both will remain exactly as they are for as long as the show continues. The last open question is Maggie. What is Maggie waiting to do? The show has given us everything except the answer to this. It has given us the intelligence test scores. It has given us the longest daycare and the daycare rebellion and the trigger motion in an empty room and 36 years of pointed stares and decisive acts performed below the radar in the spaces where nobody is watching. It has assembled a character who is, by every available measure, the most capable person in Springfield. And it has not told us what she intends to do about it. This is the correct ending for the mystery, because it is the ending that the show has always been moving toward without quite arriving. Maggie's silence is the purest version of what Springfield has been doing for 36 years, storing information, watching, waiting for the right moment to speak. And the right moment is the one the show can never arrive at, because arriving at it means ending, and the show cannot end, because we will not let it. The loop cannot break, because if the loop breaks, Maggie speaks. And if Maggie speaks, we learn what she knows. And what she knows is everything we have spent this entire script documenting, everything the show has been showing us in the background of every episode for 36 years, everything Springfield has voted to keep quiet. The radiation, the contamination, the cognitive impairment, Burns's immortality, the deal between Abe and Burns, Mona's exile, Homer's potential and what was done to it, the coma, the collective denial, the principal and the pauper's vote, the three-eyed fish and the human skeletons and the luminous rats and the chewing gum on the cooling tower and everything else the safety inspector was supposed to report and never did. Maggie knows all of this. She has been sitting in this family for 36 years, watching, storing, processing. She has never missed a day of school because she has never been old enough to attend school. She has never left the house for long enough to miss anything important. She has been present for every dinner conversation and every crisis and every moment when the truth almost surfaced and was swallowed back down before anyone had to acknowledge it. And the day she speaks, The day she takes the pacifier out and opens her mouth and says, in complete, coherent, fully formed sentences, what she has been carrying for 36 years. That is the day the loop breaks. That is why the loop cannot break. Because we are not ready for what Maggie would say. And neither, honestly, is Springfield. Let's take a breath here, because we have been deep in this for a long time, and it is worth stopping for a moment to acknowledge what we've actually been doing. We have been taking a cartoon, a show that is, at its surface level, a comedy about a dysfunctional family in a ridiculous town, and pulling it apart until the thing underneath the comedy is visible. And what we found underneath the comedy is not what you might expect. It is not cynicism. It is not nihilism. It is not the assertion that The Simpsons has always been secretly a horror show disguised as a sitcom. What we found is something more human than that. The Simpsons is about a family that loves each other in ways that are imperfect and sometimes damaging, and often completely incapable of expressing what they actually mean, but that are real and persistent, and more resilient than any of the systems arrayed against them. Burns has been trying, in various ways and for various reasons, to break this family for 36 years. The radiation has been trying, the cognitive impairment has been trying, the institutional corruption has been trying, the collective amnesia of the community has been trying, the fundamental injustice of a system that takes everything from the people who can least afford to lose it has been trying. The family is still there. Homer still means well, even when his meaning well produces outcomes that would justify a different response. Marge still loves with a completeness that the show has never been able to adequately reward, but has never stopped depicting as the foundation of everything that survives. Bart is still more than what Springfield thinks he is, and some part of him knows this, and that knowledge, however it expresses itself, however badly it tends to express itself, is the thing that will eventually take him somewhere. Lisa is still asking the questions that need to be asked, still playing the saxophone that deserves to be heard, still being the person that Springfield has no use for in a way that makes her, paradoxically, the person Springfield most needs. And Maggie is still watching, still waiting, still storing everything behind that enormous stare and that rhythmic pacifier. And the theories, all of them, every one we've examined across the past several hours, converge on this family. They all circle back to the couch on Evergreen Terrace and the people who sit on it. The radiation explains why the family looks the way it does. The coma explains why the family will never age. The Burns conspiracy explains why the family's specific configuration of damage is the configuration it is. The collective denial explains why the community will never help the family see what has been done to them. The predictions explain why the family has always felt, to everyone watching, like something we already know, something we have seen before, something that belongs to us. But none of the theories explain the thing that is actually hardest to explain. Why do we love them? We love Homer despite knowing that he is impaired and exploited and sometimes genuinely harmful to the people around him, because we also know that his love for his family is the most real thing about him, that everything else, the incompetence, the impulsiveness, the spectacular and recurring failures of judgment, is noise around a signal that is unmistakably present. We love Marge because she represents a quality of persistent, non-performative care that is increasingly rare in the cultural landscape we actually inhabit. And seeing it depicted even in a cartoon, even in a town that is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, provides something that functions like reassurance. Like evidence that this quality exists. We love Bart because we were all Bart once, or wanted to be, or knew someone who was, and his particular blend of creativity and chaos, and hidden intelligence and suppressed potential is more recognizable than we usually admit. We love Lisa because we have all felt, at some point, like the person who sees too much in a room full of people who have decided to see less. And we love Maggie because she represents the possibility that someone is paying attention when we assume nobody is. That someone in the room is seeing everything, that the silence does not mean absence. Springfield is not just a contaminated town with a corrupt billionaire and a frozen timeline, and a population too cognitively impaired by decades of radiation exposure to ask the obvious questions about their own situation. Springfield is us. The contamination is the things we absorb without choosing to. The cognitive impairment is the fog of daily life that makes sustained critical attention to our own circumstances genuinely difficult. The collective denial is the social contracts we maintain because challenging them would cost more than most of us can afford to spend. The loop is the comfort of returning to the familiar, the pleasure of the couch and the television and the show that is always there when we come back to it. Let's stay with what the floating timeline says about the American family, because this is the place where everything we have discussed converges into something that is not about The Simpsons specifically, but about what The Simpsons represents. The American family, as a cultural institution, has been in a state of declared crisis for approximately as long as The Simpsons has been on the air. Every decade since 1989 has produced a new version of the argument that the American family is changing, degrading, under threat, failing to be what it should be. The specific diagnoses have varied. It's the economy, it's the media, it's technology, it's shifting values, it's the absence of fathers, it's the pressure on mothers, it's what we're feeding children, it's what we're showing children, it's any of 100 other structural forces that are being blamed at any given moment for the state of the American household. The Simpsons debuted into the middle of this conversation and immediately became its most visible artifact. The show was initially criticized for depicting a dysfunctional family. The first major wave of Simpsons controversy was not about the show's content, but about what Homer's parenting style said about American fatherhood, what Bart's behavior said about American children, what the general chaos of the Simpsons household said about the direction of the American home. The show was blamed for contributing to the decline it was depicting. What the critics missed, and what 36 years of continued relevance has confirmed, is that The Simpsons are not a dysfunctional family in the sense the early critics meant. They are a family under pressure, economic pressure, institutional pressure, environmental pressure of a literal kind that the critics could not have anticipated, and their dysfunction is the dysfunction of a unit that is doing its best under conditions that are not designed for the best to be sufficient. Homer loves his family with everything he has. What he has is limited by forces he did not choose and cannot easily change. Marge loves her family with a consistency and a completeness that exceeds what the family can adequately reciprocate. Bart is more than Springfield has the capacity to recognize. Lisa is fighting battles that she should not have to fight alone. Maggie knows things that nobody has asked her to carry. This is not a portrait of the American family failing. This is a portrait of the American family surviving, under conditions that are specifically designed not accidentally, not through neglect, but through the deliberate choices of people with the power to design conditions to make survival the best available outcome. Burns designed some of those conditions. The economic structure of Springfield designed others. The contamination of the environment designed others still. And the collective decision of a community to maintain comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths designed the rest. The Simpsons survive in spite of all of it. Not because the show is optimistic, it is often quite the opposite, but because survival is what this family does. The couch is still full at the end of every episode, the house is still standing. The family is still intact in the specific way that matters, which is the way of people who are still trying. That is the show's actual thesis. Not the radiation, and not the coma, and not the shooting, and not the geographic impossibility. The thesis is that the American family, when placed under the kind of pressure that the American economic and social system actually places on it, does not flourish. It survives. And survival showing up every day, sitting down on the couch, being present for the people who need you to be present, even when you are impaired and damaged and operating well below your potential is enough. It has to be enough. Because in Springfield, and in the America that Springfield represents, it is what most people have. We are not watching Springfield from the outside. We are inside it. We have always been inside it. We sat down in 1989, and we never quite left. And the nuclear plant is still running. And the cooling towers are still cracked. And the water is still contaminated. And somewhere downstream, in the river that carries what the plant does not bother to contain, Blinky swims in slow circles, 3 eyes open, seeing more of the world than any fish should have to. And nobody in Springfield is asking why. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield with me. We've been through the radiation that poisons the water and shapes the biology of an entire population. We've sat with Burns in his medical suite and tried to understand what keeps him running when nothing about his situation suggests he should be running. We visited Homer in a hospital bed in April of 1993 and asked a question that the show will never officially answer. We've watched Maggie watch everything and say nothing. We've reopened the Burns shooting and found that the official answer does not hold up. We've followed Mona Simpson from a Springfield kitchen to a germ warfare lab to a cemetery where she stood beside the wrong grave. We've watched the town vote to criminalize truth. We've counted the predictions. We've seen what Ned Flanders' niceness actually is. We've looked for Springfield on a map. Every theory we examined arrived at the same place by a different route. Something is broken in Springfield. Something fundamental. Something that runs deeper than animation style or episodic convention or the accumulated continuity errors of 36 years of production. Something that the show has been showing us since the first season, in the background of every frame, in the glow of the cooling towers and the shimmer of the contaminated river, and the yellow light on every face in this impossible, unlocatable, perpetually frozen town. And the most interesting thing about all of it is this. The show never told us any of this directly. It just showed us, week after week, for 36 years. Trusting that if we paid attention long enough, we would eventually see what it had been saying all along. Some of us did. You did, if you're still here. And the question that remains, the one that the theories cannot fully answer, the one that might not have an answer at all, is what we do with what we've seen. Springfield will still be there next week. The plant will still be running. Bart will still be 10. Lisa will still be asking questions nobody wants to answer. Homer will still be stumbling through the door at 5:30. Marge will still be holding everything together with a patience that should be recognized as extraordinary and is instead taken as given. And Maggie will be watching, storing everything, waiting. If you made it this far genuinely, thank you. Drop your location and the time in the comments. Not because we need it, but because there is something about knowing that people are watching this from different places at different hours that makes the whole thing feel like something. Springfield is everywhere. And if you found this, you're already inside it. Subscribe if you want to go deeper. There is always more to find. Section 13. The characters the show forgot it made. There is a version of Springfield that exists in the spaces between the main characters. A version populated by supporting figures who were introduced with specific histories, specific purposes, specific story threads attached, and then allowed to drift into the background as the show aged. Their defining characteristics softened by repetition into something closer to costume than character. The show did this to many people over 36 seasons, but some cases are more instructive than others. And the most instructive cases are the ones where the drift reveals something about what Springfield does to people who have inconvenient inner lives. Let's talk about Sideshow Bob. Sideshow Bob's full name is Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. He was introduced as the sidekick on Krusty the Clown's children's television program, a classically trained actor with a patrician background reduced by career circumstance to performing pratfalls in grease paint, while a man. He considered his intellectual inferior, received all the attention and credit. His first significant act on the show was to frame Krusty for armed robbery, which got Krusty arrested and allowed Bob to take over the program, where he immediately began using the platform to broadcast conservative cultural commentary to the children of Springfield. Bart exposed the frame-up. Bob was arrested. Bart was 10 years old at the time, which is the age Bart will remain for as long as the show continues. And in that first encounter, the dynamic was established that would persist across every subsequent Bob appearance. A man of genuine, if ruthlessly deployed intelligence, repeatedly defeated by a child who operates on instinct and luck, and a particular quality of attention that is very hard to account for, but consistently decisive. Bob has tried to kill Bart many times. The attempts have become increasingly elaborate, increasingly theatrical, increasingly given to the specific kind of operatic excess that the show uses to signal that a character has lost perspective on his own situation. Bob is no longer someone who wants revenge and is pursuing it methodically. Bob is someone who has organized his entire existence around a vendetta against a 10-year-old, and the show plays this as comedy, which it is. But beneath the comedy is a portrait of a man who has allowed his intelligence to consume itself. Because here is what the Bob episodes actually show us, when we look at them as a cumulative body rather than a series of standalone comic set pieces. Bob started as a plausible villain with a comprehensible motive. He was talented, overlooked, treated with contempt by an entertainment industry that preferred spectacle to substance, and his response to being overlooked was violent and wrong, but at least explicable. You could trace the line from the humiliation to the crime, the logic held, but Springfield defeated him. Specifically, a 10-year-old in Springfield defeated him, repeatedly, without apparent effort, despite Bob's vastly superior education and planning capacity and strategic intelligence. And something in Bob broke over the course of those repeated defeats. Not his resolve, which remains intact. He keeps coming back, keeps planning, keeps applying his considerable intellectual resources to the problem of Bart Simpson. What broke was his sense of proportion. The later Bob appearances are not the story of a villain. They are the story of a brilliant man slowly losing his mind in a town that has proven itself capable of defeating him, no matter how carefully he plans. Springfield is the thing that broke Sideshow Bob. Not Bart, specifically. Bart is the instrument, but the specific quality of Springfield's resistance to the plans of intelligent people, the way the town's ambient chaos consistently defeats sophisticated strategy, the way Homer's accidents accomplish what Bob's schemes cannot. Bob keeps coming back to Springfield because Springfield is the unsolvable problem, and brilliant people cannot leave unsolvable problems alone. They return to them. They apply more intelligence, more planning, more resources. They run the calculations again. And the calculations keep producing outcomes that the calculations cannot account for, which is maddening, which is the specific kind of maddening that turns a competent person's gifts against them. Bob is what happens when you bring a designed intelligence into contact with a system that operates on principles design cannot anticipate. Springfield is not logical in the ways his planning assumes it will be. The town's logic is not the logic of strategic thinking. It is the logic of the loop of repetition, of reset, of consequences that do not stick and outcomes that do not accumulate in the way cause and effect is supposed to work. Bob's tragedy is that he is the smartest person in Springfield, and Springfield has made him a fool. Now let's talk about Moe. Moe Sislak is the bartender at Moe's Tavern, which is the bar where Homer and his friends drink in a way that would be alarming if it were depicted in a realistic register. Moe is, on the surface, one of the show's simpler characters, the gruff, unattractive, romantically unsuccessful everyman who provides a backdrop for Homer's social life. Except that Moe has a past that the show has deployed across multiple episodes in ways that add up to something considerably more interesting than background character. Moe was once a professional boxer. He was also once an actor, performing as a child star under a different name. These two facts sit alongside each other in the show's canon without ever being fully reconciled, which is fine. The show's relationship to continuity is not precise, but they both speak to the same underlying truth about Moe, which is that he has not always been what he is. There was a version of Moe who had something, a career, an identity, a path. He ended up here, behind this bar, in this town, serving these people. The show returns to Moe's longing, to his desire for connection and love, and a version of his life that looks different from the one he has, more often than the character's apparent function as comic background would seem to require. Moe has fallen in love multiple times across the show's run. The relationships have not lasted. He has found what he wanted briefly and lost it with a consistency that, if you track it across seasons, looks less like bad luck and more like a pattern, like something in Moe's life prevents the thing he wants most from ever fully arriving. The radiation theory has an explanation for this too, though it is more speculative than the physical mutation argument. If chronic low-level radiation exposure affects cognitive and emotional regulation, if the same contamination that reduced Homer's IQ has done something to the emotional processing architecture of the general population, then the relationship patterns we see across Springfield might not just be character quirks. They might be symptoms. The town's inability to sustain the kinds of connections that make life meaningful might be, in part, a biological consequence of what the plant has been putting in the water. Moe wants love. Springfield cannot provide it, not because love is absent from Springfield. Homer and Marge are evidence that it isn't, but because the specific kind of love Moe is looking for requires a sustained capacity for emotional availability that the town's contaminated environment may have systematically compromised in its residents. He is looking for something in a place that has damaged its own capacity to provide it. That is a sad sentence. Moe deserves a sad sentence. Then there is Barney Gumble, who deserves more than a sad sentence, but We'll have to make do with the space available here. Barney was, in the show's earlier seasons, one of Homer's closest friends. He was also, even in those seasons, an alcoholic, but an alcoholic in the way that the show handled difficult things in the early years, which is to say with enough comic distance to keep it from becoming genuinely uncomfortable, while also depicting the reality with enough honesty to make the comedy mean something. Barney was funny. He was also clearly a person whose life had been derailed by addiction, and the show knew this, and it showed you both things simultaneously. In the early seasons, there are glimpses of who Barney might have been. He is shown to be intelligent, genuinely so, in ways that the drinking has covered over but not eliminated. There is an episode in which Barney, briefly sober, reveals competencies and capabilities that no one in Springfield expected of him, because everyone in Springfield has accepted the version of Barney that is always there at the end of the bar as the complete version. The complete version, we learn, is not the complete version. The complete version was somewhere under the drinking, waiting, occasionally surfacing in glimpses that the show registers and then moves past without dwelling on, because dwelling on them would require the show to engage with what the drinking has cost Barney in a register that would push beyond what the comedy format can hold. And here is where it gets interesting. Barney is from Springfield. He has been drinking in Springfield. The water in Springfield is contaminated with radioactive material that has demonstrably affected the cognitive function of the population. We have established this. We have traced the mechanism. We have documented the effects. What has it done to Barney's baseline? We know what the drinking has done, but the drinking is in a person who is already living in a contaminated environment. The two things are not independent. The cognitive and emotional effects of the radiation are part of the context in which the addiction developed and in which the drinking that followed has been sustained. We are not arguing that the radiation caused Barney's alcoholism. That would be too simple and too convenient. But we are noting that a person trying to sustain sobriety while living in a town whose water supply contains radioactive material that demonstrably affects cognitive and emotional processing is not operating with the same resources as a person attempting the same thing outside that environment. Barney's struggle is his own. It is also happening inside a system that is not configured to support him in that struggle. Springfield has never been configured to support anyone in any struggle. That is perhaps the most consistent thing about it. Now consider the matter of Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon, the proprietor of the Quick E-Mart, who deserves more careful attention than the controversies surrounding his depiction typically allow for. Apu is a character the show has used in ways that are sometimes brilliant and sometimes careless, and the carelessness has received more retrospective attention than the brilliance, which has obscured some of what the character actually reveals about Springfield. Apu is an immigrant. He has a PhD in computer science from the Calcutta Institute of Technology. He is operating a convenience store. He works absurdly long hours. The joke version of this is that he works impossibly long shifts, and this is comedy about his work ethic. But the non-joke version is that a person with a doctorate in computer science is working 23-hour shifts at a convenience store in Springfield because the economic structure of the town does not provide any other viable path. Apu is one of the most educated people in Springfield. He is also one of the most overworked and underpaid. This is not an accident of his character or a consequence of his choices. It is what Springfield does with the credentials and capabilities of people who are not named Burns, who do not have access to the economic infrastructure that Burns controls, who are trying to build something in a town whose economic structure is organized around ensuring that most people cannot build very much. The Quick E-Mart is Apu's Springfield. It is the version of what he could have done that the town allows. It is not the version he trained for. It is the version that the town's economic gravity produced when all the other options narrowed. And he maintains it with a quality of dedication that the show recognizes, even as it sometimes treats it as the source of comedy. Apu's commitment to his store and to the community he serves through it is genuine and consistent across 36 years of production. He knows his regulars, he knows what they need. He is often the person in Springfield who is most reliably present. The store is always open, Apu is always there, the necessities of daily life are always available to the people who need them. This is not a small thing in a community as comprehensively failed by its institutions as Springfield has been. Apu provides something the institutions cannot. He provides consistency. He provides availability. He provides the specific kind of dependable presence that a community requires to function, and which the contamination and the corruption and the cognitive impairment and the collective amnesia all work against. Apu is, in this reading, one of the healthiest people in Springfield. Not because he is unaffected by the town's conditions, he has been drinking the same water and breathing the same air as everyone else, but because his role in the community requires a quality of sustained attention and care that the loop's normal tendency toward reset and forgetting does not easily accommodate. You cannot run a convenience store on collective amnesia. The shelves must be stocked whether or not the town has voted to remember what happened yesterday. The regulars must be recognized whether or not the community has decided to forget who they are. The cash register must balance regardless of what the dominant social narrative has agreed to ignore. Apu's work is anti-loop. It requires the accumulation of knowledge and relationship and consistency that the rest of Springfield is organized against. And he does it, quietly, every day, in a store that is always open. Now, let's talk about the children. Not the Simpson children, we have spent significant time with them. The other children. The children of Springfield who fill the classrooms of Springfield Elementary and whose futures are being shaped by the same contaminated environment and the same underfunded school and the same economic structure that has shaped Homer's life and Marge's choices and Bart's suppressed potential and Lisa's frustrated clarity. These children are background. They are the students in Mrs. Krabappel's class, a teacher who is clearly burnt out, who clearly was not always burnt out, who clearly has a professional history that includes more hope for the profession than she currently displays. They are the children in the schoolyard, and at the birthday parties, and in the background of the Springfield scenes that require a certain density of young people to feel populated. What is happening to them? The radiation theory says they are absorbing the same contamination as everyone else, at the developmental stage when contamination does its most lasting work. The formative years, the years when the brain is building the neural infrastructure it will use for the rest of a life, are the years when exposure to the conditions the plant produces would be most consequential. These children are being formed inside a contamination zone. Whatever the radiation does to the adult population cognitive impairment, physical mutation, the specific alterations that Homer and Maggie represent at opposite ends of the spectrum, it does to the developing brains and bodies of the next generation before those brains and bodies have finished becoming themselves. Springfield is not just damaged in the present. Springfield is reproducing its damage into the future. Every child born in this town is born into the conditions that produce the previous generation's damage. The loop perpetuates itself not just through social mechanisms and collective amnesia and the maintenance of Burns's power structure, but biologically. Through the children who grow up drinking the contaminated water and breathing the contaminated air and attending the school that cannot afford to give them anything better than what the town's conditions allow. The most unsettling thing about this is that the show has shown it to us, not directly, not with a narrator explaining the biological mechanism, but in the faces of the children in every classroom scene, in every background shot of Springfield Elementary, in every moment when the camera holds on the faces of kids who are growing up in a place that is not designed for their flourishing. They are yellow. They have 4 fingers. Their eyes are large in the way that all Springfield eyes are large. They are being formed by the same environment that formed the adults who are failing them. And they do not know it. They cannot know it. Because the cognitive impairment that the environment produces is most severe precisely at the developmental stage they are in, the thing that would allow them to question their environment is the thing the environment has most affected. Springfield is doing to its children what it has always done to its children. And it will do so again in the next generation, and the one after that, and the one after that, for as long as the plant runs and the water flows and the cooling towers stand against the Springfield skyline in the background of every outdoor shot the show has ever broadcast. This is the loop in its most fundamental form, not the narrative loop, not the floating timeline, the biological loop, the one that does not require collective denial or social consensus to maintain, the one that maintains itself in the bodies of the people who are born here. Springfield reproduces its conditions in its children because the conditions are in the water and the air and the soil and the food and the very environment of being alive in this place. The loop does not need anyone to vote for it. The loop is in the water. Section 14. What we owe the show. We have spent considerable time in Springfield now, and before we leave we should be honest about something. Everything we have done in this script, every theory examined, every thread pulled, every connection drawn between one episode's detail and another season's revelation, is an act of interpretation. The show did not write a manifesto about radiation contamination. The writers did not assemble the Homer coma theory as a deliberate structural choice and embed it in the show's architecture waiting to be found. The geographic impossibility of Springfield was not designed as a legal defense for the nuclear plant's regulatory evasion. These are readings. They are readings with genuine textual support. The evidence we have cited throughout is real, drawn from the show's actual canonical content, and the patterns we have identified are real patterns that emerge from that content. But they are still interpretations. The show's writers made choices that were primarily comedic, and the depth we have found in those choices is partly there and partly produced by the kind of close attention that any sufficiently complex, long-running work will reward. This is not a reason to dismiss the theories. Interpretation is how meaning is made from art. The things we have identified in Springfield, the patterns, the convergences, the places where one detail illuminates another, are genuinely there in the way that hidden structure is there in any work sophisticated enough to contain it. We did not put them there. We found them. But we should be honest about what kind of finding it is. The Springfield nuclear power plant has 342 safety violations. This is canon. Homer has an IQ of 55. This is canon. Blinky the three-eyed fish exists and is a direct consequence of the plant's environmental contamination. This is canon. The residents of Springfield have physical characteristics that distinguish them from non-Springfield characters in the show's visual vocabulary. This is real and observable. Burns's weekly treatments involve radiation and keep him alive. This is canon. What is not canon is the synthesis, the argument that all of these things connect into a coherent system of meaning, that the show has been telling us a specific story about power and contamination and cognitive damage and institutional complicity that it cannot tell directly. That synthesis is ours. It is produced by looking at the show with a kind of sustained, systematic attention that the show was not designed to receive and that most viewers do not apply to it. And yet the synthesis holds. The elements connect. The patterns are coherent. The convergence of the different theories on the same observations is not accidental. The Simpsons is a funnier show than the dark readings it generates. It is also a show that has been telling you something for 36 years that is darker than the comedy contains, and the evidence for that something is in the episodes, waiting to be found by anyone who looks at the show as a whole rather than episode by episode. We owe the show this kind of attention, not because it demands it. The Simpsons is comfortable as the thing most people take it to be, a long-running animated comedy with a great first 10 seasons and an extended later period, but because it repays it. Because when you look at it carefully, when you trace the threads and follow the connections and take the continuity seriously rather than dismissing it as production error, what you find is a portrait of American life that is considerably more honest and considerably more disturbing than the comedy format typically allows. The show knew what it was doing, at least in the beginning. The writers who built the architecture of Springfield in those first 10 seasons were building something more complex than a standard animated sitcom. They were building a world with internal logic, with cause and effect, with characters whose histories shaped their present circumstances, with a social system that had specific mechanics and specific pathologies and specific ways of perpetuating itself. And then the show ran for 30 more years, and the original architects moved on, and new writers came in who worked within the architecture without always understanding its foundations, and some of the structural logic got lost in the process. This is normal. It is what happens to all long-running collaborative works. The original intention becomes diffuse. The parts that were designed to cohere start to drift, but the foundation is still there. The original architecture persists underneath the additions and renovations, and sometimes structurally unsound alterations of 30 years of continued production. And when you go back to the foundation, when you look at what the show built in the first place before everything else was added on top, you find the thing we have been exploring throughout this script. You find a town that is doing to its residents what the plant does to the water. You find a family trying to hold together in a place that is not designed for holding together. You find a baby watching everything from behind a pacifier, waiting for the right moment to speak. You find an unconscious man in a hospital bed, dreaming about the family he cannot reach, refusing to let the dream end because ending the dream means finding out how long he has been gone. You find a town that knows the truth and has voted to make the truth illegal. You find all of this, and then you find something you did not expect to find at the end of it. You find that it is beautiful. Not the contamination, not the corruption, not the exploitation or the impairment, or the 3 generations of damage that one man's cruelty produced. Those things are not beautiful. Those things are exactly what they are. What is beautiful is the family. What is beautiful is that the family survives. That Homer and Marge are still on the couch together after everything. That Bart still misbehaves with a creativity that is genuinely impressive when you look at it without the frame of behavior problem. That Lisa still plays her saxophone and still asks her questions and still believes, against all available evidence, that the answers matter. That Maggie is still watching, still storing, still waiting. What is beautiful is that the loop, for all its darkness, for all the mechanisms that maintain it and all the damage that those mechanisms produce, is also the thing that keeps this family together. The reset that makes the contamination permanent also makes the love permanent. The freeze that locks the children in childhood also preserves them in the moment when the family was all together and everything was intact. The loop is a prison. The loop is also the only home some of us have ever known. Springfield is a nightmare. Springfield is also the place we keep coming back to when we need to feel like we belong somewhere. Let's talk about the writing staff one more time, because the people who made this show deserve acknowledgement for what they built. The early Simpsons writing room was, by the accounts of everyone who worked in it, an extraordinary environment. Highly educated, fiercely competitive, obsessive in its commitment to quality, demanding of itself in ways that few television productions have matched before or since. The writers did not just write jokes. They built a world. They thought carefully about what Springfield was, what its people were, how its systems worked, what the rules of the reality they were creating actually were. They argued about character and motivation and consequence and internal consistency with a rigor that is more associated with literary fiction than with animated television. And the world they built was built to last. The foundation they poured in those first years, the characterizations, the institutional logic, the social dynamics, the specific quality of Springfield's relationship to itself was solid enough that the show has been standing on it for 36 years. Even through the seasons when the craftsmanship of what was being built on top of it was less meticulous. The radiation theory, the coma theory, the Burns conspiracy, the Maggie intelligence argument, these are readings of a world that was built with enough care to support them. You cannot find this kind of depth in work that was produced carelessly. The patterns we have traced are there because the people who made this show put them there. Not always consciously, not always deliberately, but through the accumulated effect of caring about what they were making in a sustained, serious, professional way. When Matt Groening and James L. Brooks and Al Jean and the writers of the early seasons assembled Springfield, they were doing something harder than making a comedy. They were making a world. A world with internal logic and historical depth and characters whose circumstances were the product of forces they didn't choose and couldn't easily change. A world that was funny, yes, deeply, consistently, brilliantly funny in ways that changed what animated comedy could be and what comedy generally could be, but that was also honest about things that are difficult to be funny about poverty and exploitation and cognitive limitation and institutional failure, and the specific sadness of a life that could have been different if the forces arranged against it had been different. The show deserves our attention because it has been honest with us for 36 years about things that are genuinely difficult to be honest about power and its consequences, about the gap between what a community could be and what it is, about the things that get preserved when time stops and the things that get lost, about what it costs to be intelligent in a place that does not reward intelligence, about what it costs to be good in a place that does not reward goodness, about what it means to love people who are imperfect in ways that sometimes cause real harm and to keep loving them anyway because the love is realer than the harm. This is what The Simpsons has been about, underneath the gags and the celebrity cameos and the increasingly surreal plots of the later seasons. This is what it has always been about. And it is worth sitting with, worth taking seriously, worth the kind of sustained attention we have given it here. The plant is still running. The water is still contaminated. The cooling towers are still cracked. And the family is still there. On the couch. On Evergreen Terrace. In Springfield. Wherever that is. Rest now. Let the show wash over you. Let Springfield be what it is, beautiful and damaged and perpetually, impossibly itself. And when you wake up, it will still be there. It always is. Appendix. The threads we didn't pull. We spent considerable time in Springfield tonight, but Springfield is larger than any single document can fully map. There are threads we touched and did not follow to their ends, and threads we did not reach at all, and they deserve at least a mention before we close. The mystery of Sideshow Bob, who is both the most cartoonishly obvious villain the show has ever produced and, on closer examination, a deeply sad figure, a man of genuine culture and intelligence, trapped in a cycle of obsession with a 10-year-old boy that the show has played as comedy for 30 years while quietly depicting something closer to a psychological prison than a villainous career. The matter of Chief Wiggum's police department, which has been ineffective for so long and in such specific ways that the ineffectiveness no longer reads as incompetence but as structural. A police force that cannot solve crimes in Springfield is a police force that cannot hold Springfield's power structures accountable. The question of whether the ineffectiveness is incidental or by design is one the show has never directly asked. The Springfield Elementary School, which has been underfunded and poorly administered for 36 years in ways that the show has portrayed as comedy, but which represent, taken seriously, the systematic failure of the public education infrastructure to serve a community that desperately needs it to function. Springfield's children are in a school that cannot properly educate them. This is partly Burns's fault, directly, through the oil theft and other interventions. It is also partly the failure of a community that has accepted this situation as normal. The question of what happened to all the other people who have worked at the nuclear plant over the years. We know Homer is the safety inspector. We see the plant employees occasionally. We know the plant has been operating for decades with the specific violations we documented in the second section. The question of what that operation has done to the people who work inside it, not in the ambient, slow way it affects the general population, but in the direct, immediate way that proximity to an active reactor with 342 safety violations would affect a person who spends 8 hours a day inside the building, is one the show has gestured toward, but never followed. The full arc of Apu's story, which is larger and more complicated than the controversy that eventually came to define it, and which contains within it an exploration of immigrant experience in an American small town that the show handled with more nuance in its earlier seasons than it is typically given credit for. The recurring motif of music in the show, the way Lisa's saxophone functions as both a character trait and a metaphorical statement about artistic aspiration in a community that has no infrastructure for artistic aspiration. The way Homer's relationship to music, he was briefly famous. He has had moments of genuine musical connection, reveals something about his inner life that the comedy usually covers over. The Treehouse of Horror episodes, which exist outside the show's canonical continuity but which have, across 36 years of production, assembled an alternate Springfield that is sometimes more honest about what the main show is implying than the main show itself. The horror anthology format licenses a directness that the comedy format resists. The things Springfield is afraid of in the Treehouse of Horror episodes are the things Springfield has been afraid of all along. The matter of Springfield's political structure, which the show has depicted as thoroughly captured by Burns's interests, but which has also, across various episodes, shown moments of genuine democratic resistance that the show treats as temporary aberrations before returning the status quo. Springfield has voting. Springfield has elections. Springfield has a mayor and a police force and a legal system and all the other institutions that democratic governance requires. And all of those institutions function, in practice, as extensions of the economic power structure that Burns represents. The mayor is corrupt. The police force is incompetent in specific targeted ways. The legal system, when it appears, tends to produce outcomes that serve the interests of the wealthy and the powerful. This is not a cynical or unusual picture of American municipal governance. It is, in many respects, a very accurate one. Small American cities often have exactly this relationship between formal democratic structures and informal economic power. The elections happen, the votes are counted, but the outcomes are shaped by who has the resources to fund campaigns, control media, employ a significant fraction of the voting population, and make the economic cost of unfavorable electoral results clear to anyone considering them. Burns does not need to rig elections in Springfield, though the show implies he occasionally does. He simply needs to be the person who employs most of the people who vote. The ballot may be secret, but the employment contract is not, and the people of Springfield understand the relationship between their vote and their paycheck in ways that do not require explicit statement. The show has depicted this dynamic since its earliest seasons, and it has never resolved it, because it cannot be resolved without resolving Burns, and Burns cannot be resolved without ending the show's primary structural relationship. So the mayor remains corrupt, and the police remain conveniently ineffective, and the legal system produces outcomes that consistently surprise no one who understands how Springfield actually works. And the people of Springfield vote, and their votes are counted, and nothing changes. This is also a loop, a political loop layered on top of the narrative loop and the biological loop and the social loop of collective denial. Springfield is governed by a form of democracy that produces the outcomes that the economic structure requires, which is to say the outcomes that Burns requires, which is to say no outcomes that would threaten the plant's continued operation or the contamination's continued progress or the population's continued impairment. The democratic loop is perhaps the most mundane of all the loops we have identified. It requires no supernatural mechanism, no radiation-induced mutation, no dreaming coma to maintain. It simply requires that the people with money continue to have more political influence than the people without it, which is a requirement that American society has historically been quite good at meeting. Springfield is too large to finish. This is part of its nature. 36 years of content, produced by hundreds of writers working across decades, will always contain more than any analysis can fully retrieve. The patterns we have documented are real. The threads we followed are real. The convergence of multiple theories on the same set of observations is real and significant. But there is always more in Springfield than what you found. There is always another episode you forgot about, another background detail that means more than it appears to, another character whose story the show started and never resolved, another question the show is asking without expecting an answer. That is what makes Springfield what it is, not the answers, which are always partial and always contested. The questions. The accumulation of questions, layered over 36 seasons like geological strata, each layer pressing down on the ones below it, creating something denser and stranger and more interesting than any single layer would be on its own. The show is the questions. Springfield is the questions, and the questions will outlast us all. The plant will still be running when we are gone. The cooling towers will still be cracked. The water will still be contaminated. And Blinky will still be swimming in that river with his 3 strange eyes open, seeing everything. Rest now. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. That's the whole point. Closing. The thing about Blinky. We keep coming back to Blinky, the 3-eyed fish pulled from a river near the nuclear power plant in Springfield's second season, almost 35 years ago now by our calendar, who became a local celebrity and a national news story, and a gubernatorial campaign's central piece of evidence, and then a punchline, and then background, and then forgotten, except that we are not done with Blinky. Blinky is not done with us. Blinky is the show's most honest moment. Not the most emotional, that is probably Mona's death, or the look on Homer's face when Bart confesses at the hospital bedside, or the last frame of a certain early season episode where someone says something true in a way that cuts through everything else. But the most honest, the most direct statement of what the show has been saying from the beginning. Here is a fish with 3 eyes. Here is the reason it has 3 eyes. Here is the person responsible for the reason. Here is that person eating the fish on live television to demonstrate its harmlessness. Here is the audience watching. Here is the lack of follow-up study. Every question the show could have asked and didn't is contained in that sequence. Every convenient looking away. Every comfortable choice to accept the reassurance rather than investigate the evidence. Every moment where Springfield looked at something that should have been alarming and found a reason to move past it. Blinky is Springfield in a fish tank. Blinky is the condensed argument. The 3 eyes are the contamination made visible in a way that cannot be denied and is denied anyway, through the simple expedient of eating the evidence on camera and declaring the matter closed. And the matter was closed, because that is what Springfield does. It closes matters. The coma theory says Blinky is a symbol produced by Homer's unconscious mind, a dream object that represents the contamination Homer knew about and could not acknowledge, externalized into a fish because the dream needed something specific and visual to anchor the anxiety. The radiation theory says Blinky is direct evidence of what the plant is doing to the water, and by extension to everything that drinks it. The collective denial theory says Blinky is the moment that Springfield's amnesia was most clearly revealed. The town watched Burns eat the fish and accepted the performance as proof of safety, because the performance was what they needed it to be. All three of these are true. They are true simultaneously. That is how good symbols work. Blinky has been swimming in that river for 35 years. Every day that passes in which the plant continues to operate and the water continues to carry what the plant puts in it, Blinky's third eye sees things that the two-eyed fish around him cannot see. The additional perspective, the wider field of vision, the capacity to look in directions that normal eyes cannot reach. We have been trying, tonight, to see the way Blinky sees, with the third eye that the radiation gave the fish and that we, as an audience, can only approximate through the sustained attention of trying to look at something we have known for decades as though we are encountering it for the first time. What we found when we tried to see this way is what we have been documenting across these several hours: the contamination, the cover-up, the dreaming father, the brilliant baby, the shooting that was not solved, only closed, the mother who was erased, the town that votes to forget, the predictions that are actually diagnoses, the dead man who keeps coming back, the nice man whose niceness is a cage, the town on no map that is somehow on every map. And beneath all of it, underneath every theory and every thread and every moment where one detail illuminated another and the pattern became briefly legible underneath all of it, the same thing: a family, on a couch, in a house on a street, in a town that should not be able to exist and somehow does. Still there, every Sunday. Still trying, still loving each other in the imperfect, insufficient, unreasonably persistent way that they have always loved each other, across every disaster and every reset and every episode that ended with them right back where they started. That is the show. In the end, after all of it, that is the show. A family that will not stop being a family no matter what Springfield does to make it stop. The nuclear plant can run, the water can carry what it carries. Burns can take his weekly treatment and continue his century-long project of engineering outcomes that serve his interests and no one else's. The town can vote to forget. The skeletons can stay in the basement. The fish can have three eyes. The family is still there. And that more than any theory, more than any thread we pulled tonight, is the thing that keeps us coming back. The plant is still running. The family is still home. And Blinky swims on,